Good morning, everyone. On the behalf of Nalanda University, it is my honor to welcome you all, distinguished delegates, think tank researchers, and scholars from across the world, to the inaugural edition of the Nalanda Development Dialogue. Before we begin, we invite our distinguished guests to kindly come forward for the traditional lamp lighting ceremony, a symbol of knowledge, dispelling darkness, and most befitting of the Nalanda spirit. I request the dignitaries to please come forward. Professor Sachin Chaturvedi, Vice Chancellor, Nalanda University; Professor Samika Ravi, Member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister; Professor Deepak Nayyar, Emeritus Professor of Economics, Jawaharlal Nehru University; Professor Thomas Pogge, Yale University. We thank our distinguished guests and request them to please be seated. We are gathered here at a place that once stood as the greatest center of learning across Asia, the spirit of ancient Nalanda to open inquiry and cross border dialogue feels particularly relevant today as we come together to ask some of the harder questions about where global development is headed and what we must do differently. This dialogue is built on two convictions that cooperative thinking matters and the collective introspection is long overdue. Over the next 2 days, we hope this space become exactly like that, a genuine conversation, not just a series of presentations. To open our proceedings, I now have the privilege to invite our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. He is a distinguished scholar of development economics and global governance and independent director on the board of Reserve Bank of India. He was a former Director General of RIS New Delhi and the institutional builder platforms like the Network of Southern Think Tanks. He brings to Nalanda University both the academic depth. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to the inaugural session of the Nalanda Development Dialogue. We are extremely delighted to have each one of you who have been partnering with this larger issue that we all of us are concerned with, both in terms of our partnership for better world, but also in terms of how we bring in equity and inclusion in the development process. We are also equally concerned in terms of strategies that are needed, the kind of world that we are ending up with, and what we actually want. So from that perspective, sitting in a state that is also grappling with the larger development challenges, but successfully overcoming multiple impediments that are there, both in terms of resources, in terms of skills, and also in terms of the potential realization. And this part, I think, is important. the idea of inequality comes in largely because people want to be in the areas which are already developed. And as a result, the areas which are not so developed, not so advanced, people, skills, resources do not flow in that direction. Fortunately, in India, with electoral politics, things have evolved and have changed to a great extent. Bihar, which was once described as a basket case, has now bounced back through a very high growth rate we would be discussing in the course of the day. There are new opportunities, and so are the opportunities with our northeastern India. And I'm extremely delighted that Netra colleagues have joined in here for taking this journey forward, again in the region where development is still a dream. And I think for that purpose, universities like Nalanda have great responsibility to bring in conversations which are inclusive and are addressing the strategies for minimization of inequalities. We could not have thought of a better panel than what we have here for inaugural. Both Professor Thomas Poggi and Professor Deepak Nair are people who have established very high standards in our analytical rigor and frameworks that are important for an inclusive global order. Both of them have identified themselves with issues and causes, not just confined to academics, but also in terms of practical action that is needed. Academics Against Poverty is something with which Professor Thomas Pogge has been working with. His work on reducing corruption, finding out new ways to reduce corruption in public life, and also in terms of identifying new resources that are needed for mobilization, is a strategy in terms of how we overcome the dead weight of intellectual property rights, is something that Thomas is known for. His work on Health Impact Fund and its extension to the climate change and bringing in the Climate Impact Fund so as to have equity and inclusion both ensured even when intellectual property rights or patents, they may keep drugs away from patients. How we mobilize resources, how we create common funds to overcome this dead weight is something that Thomas has been working with. It's a very delicate balance that you require when you have to serve the public policy objective without compromising the entrepreneurial incentives that are needed. Private sector is extremely important for delivering what public policy may require. But how to balance them is important. And this is area where Professor Deepak Nair comes in. Long back when Gunnar Myrdal rejected growth potential for Asia and described multiple challenges as something that would be foreclosing options for Asia to grow, the work that Professor Deepak Nair has brought out, it brings in the ideas that are important for us to focus on. This is something which is trying to bring in the idea where Asian countries are going to be the lead in terms of how the world comes together. The idea of we connecting with Europe and also Euro-Asian configurations that are being discussed at multiple levels through bilateral agreements, through regional agreements, and also through bit of multilateral touch on specific dimensions. I think these issues are important. In our today's deliberation, our idea is to bring forward the discussions and debates which are there on what should be the focus for post-2030. And for that, I was looking for a policy maker who has appreciation for growth, but also has soft corner for development. There is no one other than Shamika Ravi, who is here with us today in the government, who appreciates both development and economic growth. Role of private sector, but also the necessary space for public sector. A sensitivity for universities and their scope and potential for contribution is something which is extremely important. And she has also recognized the role that journals have to play. And she has herself dedicated an identified time window that she has to give as editor-in-chief for reviving the journal from the Gokhale Institute. So she has tried to identify the causes that are important for rigorous academic work that is needed for the new articulations that we hear from political leadership. Being part of Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, she's trying to bring in the change that is needed, both in academics, but also in the way policy making is to be done. The idea of granularity that is needed with details of evidences for policy making, she is the one who has been establishing. So I thought Nalanda Development Dialogue should bring in dimensions of regional inequality, not just in India, but also in our neighboring countries. And I'm delighted that we have colleagues from Nepal who are going to contribute in the way we see integration within the subcontinent, but also at a larger level when it comes to global south. Our idea is also to make people realize the ecological limits that are there for economic growth, and also how we see the current fragmentation that is affecting most of us after the derailment of sustainable development goals. The debates are on what we should adopt after 2030 and what should be the new target. India has to participate, and this September, when the UN General Assembly meets in New York, discussions on the idea of post 2030 is going to be extremely important for us to work out the details. This is also happening at a point when the official development assistance, ODA as it is called, has consistently declined. The West is facing biggest crisis, not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of confidence. The conflict and contestations have affected both. And as a result, whether it is in Munich conference or in Raisina or many other platforms, we are repeatedly reminded of this. And this is something which is going to adversely affect SDG and the geopolitical engagement that is needed. And from that perspective, it is all the more important for us to identify how Global South is going to take the climate and development balance forward. And from that perspective, what are the new options? This year, Shamika, India is also hosting the BRICS presidency with Sudhakar Dalila, the Secretary for Economic Relations. We are trying to provide the inputs that are needed. The BRICS Academic Forum is to be soon organized and would be giving its report. We are part of the one with Ministry of Finance for the BRICS network as to how we take forward. Being on the board of the Reserve Bank, we are also trying to see in terms of the financial sector connect of the BRICS. The idea that Russia and China have been pushing in for alternative efforts and pushing in for de-dollarization, in what way it would affect global economy, whether Chinese currency, RMB, is really ready to replace dollar, but also at the digital payment architecture, what kind of work that we are trying to bring in. In this context, the excessive emphasis that has come in from China and Russia on the civilizational status of these countries has also posed multiple geopolitical issues that are important. And that's where the challenges that we are facing at this point are going to further polarize the world. And that's where the role for us would come in, because large set of development issues are on table, particularly the issues which we raised during India's G20 presidency of multilateral development banks, MDBs, and their recapitalization issue. The idea of new credit system that we need for bringing down the indebtedness that we have seen across 48 most vulnerable countries, where indebtedness has gone up and repayments have grown from 17% to 26% for 48 countries. This is extremely shocking and disappointing. New development paradigm, which we have been discussing for more than a decade now, I think time has come to explore possibilities for post-Washington consensus. This is something that I'm sure Professor Deepak Nair would be touching upon in terms of how broad geographical contestations that we are seeing, the geopolitical contestations that we are seeing, what new options we have. Secretary General of the UN has already proposed to go beyond GDP and bring in new measurements that are needed, particularly post-COVID. Everybody has realized the importance of the well-being, and I think well-being as an indicator, efforts are on for its measurement. Efforts are also on to juxtapose GDP parameter above the way well-being is to be calculated. With 37 parameters that OECD has identified for well-being, we have seen how if countries like Norway would appear much more importantly in the way rankings are to be done for the countries, above the countries which are number one or number two economies at the global level. We are also trying to see how some of them can really be reconciled in form of new parameters, whether we go beyond Human Development Index or we go even beyond the ideas that are important in terms of Bhutan's own gross happiness index. So from that perspective, issues beyond 2030, they bring in new dimensions of engagement and also provide us opportunity for taking the engagement forward. In our 1.5-day deliberation, we have tried to bring in multiple perspectives. My idea in this conference, as I worked with my colleagues, Dr. Kishore Davla and also with Anand, Munir and Shisha, we have tried to bring in conceptual frameworks for inaugural session, and we are extremely thankful to our colleague Nicola, with whom we discussed this idea and trying to bring in the Global Solution Summit and the issues which are there with our partnership with EPIA and IDOS and Dean Sonabasan, who is here. We are trying to see what are the issues that are important. Professor Charan Singh ji had brought in greater discussions and debate on dimensions of engagement for Indian development model. What are the ways we can really connect, and what are the ways we really see external sector to play in, where role of Professor Mohanty and Professor Shekhar Sinha Roy, Nitya, that has given strength in terms of how export-led economic growth has its own limitations, which are important. And that's where from NDB, Srinivas' own experience comes in very handy for us. Bringing in gender dimension, we had opportunity of interacting with Professor Jay Pandit, and I'm glad that he has joined in. This is also important for us to see how some of the other developing countries are exploring Professor Mishra's experience in countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia. That comes in very handy for us. So I thought that some of these minds can contribute on how we actually crystallize, particularly on challenges like food security, where Professor Malhotra has been working in a state like Madhya Pradesh, where issues are of great significance. Professor Panda has also contributed in some of these debates. So idea across this strategy is to bring in Nalanda development dialogue around local, national, and global issues and see these linkages forward. I once again thank everyone for their participation and support and their presence here. We are trying to take this dialogue to a greater height next year, when it would be a much bigger endeavor, Nicola, and we can see in terms of how we connect with the Global Solution Summit, but also other international endeavors to highlight the development dimensions. Unfortunately, from social sciences, particularly from economics, issues related to development studies have taken backseat. In UK, it has almost disappeared, and in US, probably it never appeared. So we need to see how in economics profession we revive this and bring in other professions which are important. Professor Thomas Pogge has shaped philosophy and study of philosophy to our real life problems. In India, most of the departments in philosophy, please forgive me, Professor Godavari Mishra, philosophers are in their own world. That's what we define. But we have come at a stage of economic development when sociology, psychology, philosophy, languages they have to come forward and they have to remind us as to economics is not the only solution for taking us forward. So I stop here and once again welcome everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Vice Chancellor, for your opening remarks and for setting the tone for Nalanda Development Dialogue. And with that, it is my privilege to now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Shamika Ravi. Dr. Shamika Ravi's work sits at the intersection of rigorous economic research and real-world policy. As a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister and Secretary to the Government of India, she contributes to shaping some of the most important economic conversations in the country today. Over the years, her career has moved seamlessly between academia, policy research, and public engagement. She has served as Director of Research at Brookings India, Vice President for Economic Policy at the Observer Research Foundation, and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, bringing deep analytical insight to questions that matter for India's development. A defining focus of Dr. Shamika Ravi's work is a sustained engagement with the challenges of development, whether in finance, healthcare, urbanization, gender equality, welfare, or poverty. Her research combines strong empirical analysis with a commitment to making complex policy questions accessible to wider audiences, and her work is widely published and frequently featured in leading global and Indian media. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to welcome Dr. Shamika Ravi to deliver the keynote address. Ma'am, please.
Namaskar. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful campus. We had the great privilege of seeing a small part of it, but I must say we were blown away. So I do encourage the visitors to take some time out and enjoy the solitude, which I think we deserve. Respected Professor Deepak Nair, Professor Poge, all the scholars in the room, students, faculty members, and this is homecoming for me, this is my community. I have been a professor of economics for the last 24 years now. And I must say, this is a very difficult time to be having some of these conversations. As Sachin very clearly said, development has taken a backstage as far as the training of economics is concerned. Particularly in the Western universities and so on. And yet, of course, if you just look at the recent Nobel citations or the awards, we have been focusing on some of these issues. My job here is a relatively simple one. I'm going to give you a vision of what we are trying to achieve, but at the same time, what are the big challenges that lie ahead. You know, you've often heard different people, beginning with the Honorable Prime Minister, but most of the leadership, talk about India at 2047, Vikasit Bharat 2047. We can get into the mechanics of it, what each ministry has to contribute therefore. Each state has to. India is too large to have singular vision. And while you have so many vibrant state and union territory economies, each unique in its own way, but a lot of that vision and that objective has to be translated. It is being translated across the country. But it's important to also recognize that we will grow in a very unique way. The one thing which we are clear about is that we cannot blindly mimic the development path of the OECD nations or the developed world that has come before us. Ecologically and environmentally, that would be irresponsible, which is why for a country of this per capita income, we are signatory to some of the loftiest and the most ambitious climate targets. But the pandemic truly was a wake-up call for us. When we started looking at some of the data, and I was sitting outside the government then, daily trying to churn out numbers and make sense of the pandemic. But the one statistics that did startle me was that this is the first time in human history when such a large number of people globally died alone without a family or a kin nearby. Now imagine after decades of progress and development and growth, if this is the kind of an outcome that we are staring at, which if you begin to analyze economy after economy, the big demographic shifts, the breakdown in institutions of family, all of that is the commercial approach to development, what we have seen in the past, is definitely going to take us to that path. There is a very unique role for women at the center of this. And of course, today is Women's Day, but that's not the only reason I'm going to talk about why women are central to the development path that India is laying out for itself. Most of East Asian countries, most Asian countries, I would say, are struggling with a very rapidly declining fertility rate. In India, if you look at the data of the last 12 years, and particularly the last 8 years of the periodic labor force survey, you will notice that after an initial decline from 2004-05 to 16-17, female labor force participation has seen a resurgence. Now, when many multilateral institutions do studies or when they advise countries, it's very prescriptive in nature when it says you must increase your female labor force participation. But it's almost as if development actually has switches. You can turn on the switch. It's important to understand that a declining female labor force participation or a low female labor force participation is an outcome of the multiple institutions and the incentives and the kind of mechanisms which are at play. So it's important to understand what is driving, what are the different factors driving an outcome where women are not able to go out and work or seek work. That is what female labor force participation is about. If you parse the data more clearly, what do you see? That in rural India, there has been a reversal. In fact, there has been a 69% increase in female labor force participation in the last 8 years. It is remarkable. But in urban India, the problem persists. We are still struggling with only 24% female labor force participation in urban India. Why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because it is an outcome of the institutions and incentives that exist. It coexists with the fact that women have now gotten more education than historically ever before in India. Women are getting more trained than ever before. But when it comes to entering the labor force or entering the labor market, there is a barrier. There is something that is holding them back. And that takes us to the institution of family and what exactly are women spending their time on. This is when we begin to look at the data from the Western nations, which are far more developed and hence have market mechanisms to provide a lot of this value which women are doing it in India in the household. For instance, taking care of children and the elderly. The Time Use survey in India tells us that a working age woman from the age 18 to 59 spends anywhere between 4.5 to 5 hours every day taking care of someone. Right now, we have more children in the population, but in 27 years to 30 years, we will have more elderly. But the need for care will remain. All that care is being provided inside the household. It's a non-market activity. And since it is a non-market activity with non-transaction in terms of money, it is not in the GDP. So we estimate what is the size of this value creation which is in the household, because this is great value. But how much is it? And we estimate that it amounts to anywhere between 15 and 17% of the GDP based on the assumptions you make of the shadow price, wage, etc. Now imagine 15% of the value of the GDP is the kind of value creation inside the household, which is not part of the GDP, so it's a measurement problem first. And perhaps that statistically is relatively easy for economists to do. We can put a shadow wage and we can derive. But what do you do with an analysis like that? What does it mean? Well, number one, the fact that we don't measure it also means we discount it. We discount it in the household. So a housewife is usually termed as being not working. And we discount it in the society. And that obviously will require policy intervention and interventions at the community level. But at the end of the day, I think democracies, and for citizens, and half its citizens, policy must ensure that choices are in fact real choices. That if these young girls are studying more than ever and working so hard, they should be able to work outside the house if they so choose to do. But one of the most labor-intensive tasks which is holding them back is the fact that they need to take care of, particularly right now, children. Now, earlier you had the institution of family. You had grandparents who pitched in so the women could go out and work. Family structures are breaking down. A large part of it have already broken down. If you look at the theses or the books, writings of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, then you do realize what has happened in the US in particular. But if you look at East Asian countries, Japan, you look at China itself, the falling fertility is a response function. It's a response to the kind of pressures women feel. The women are voting with the choice of how many children to have. Now, if the family structures are breaking down, and this declining fertility in India happening at a time when our per capita income is such that we have just come out of poverty, we have a long way to go. So if the relative size of the working population shrinks, while the dependent population continues to grow, this is not sustainable in any case. It's very expensive. Western nations have been able to deal with this through migration. But the big fears in China today is that they are going to grow old before they are going to become rich. Demography matters. And it fundamentally hinges on the back of what women can contribute to the GDP and in what form, and of course, in the fact that it should be honest choice. So you will hear a lot more conversation within not just government of India, but increasingly state governments of a phrase called care economy. Growing investments into care infrastructure. Thinking of fiscal responses, tax policies which are family friendly. This conversation will gather more and more steam. Of course, blindly copying modern or advanced nations before us will also prove to be fatal, because we do know that the largest economy in the world, which is the US, it has 0 days of paid maternity, which makes it impossible for women to then realize their true potential. What I'm trying to motivate here is that if left to market solutions, markets do fail. And as a professor from a business school, it might sound like a shocking statement, but a lot of policy is based on the fact that market failures happen. The fact that you have 0 days of paid maternity leave in the richest nation in the world is a market failure. Now, we have had our own experiments. India went from 3 months of paid maternity to 6 months of paid maternity. And of course, to policymakers, it sounded like what an advancement. But to the realists in the room, the economists who could actually measure what the opportunity cost will be, we should have known that many businesses will now stop recruiting women. Because who is going to pay for half a year's salary at an economy such as ours? Not the small, medium enterprises. So in many industries, we saw them replaced. They reduced employment of women and they replaced them by men, including in traditionally female-oriented sectors such as nursing. Now, here I am to tell you that there is a unique economist's way of looking at policy. It is to identify the real costs. The real costs are not just in terms of how much the government pays for it. The real costs are in terms of the distortions we create subsequently. So to the best of our abilities, it's all about measuring what will be the different kinds of costs. Here, let me give you an example, one other, in terms of a flagship program of the government of India. It started in 2005. In 2006, it became a policy called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. It's a scheme which has held us in very good state. It is a workfare program where rural households are assured 100 days of minimum wage employment. We had the great benefit of doing a randomized control trial, an assessment over a long period, and for researchers, 4 years is long. In the history of a growing nation, 4 years is nothing. But we did study what NREGA was doing at the ground level from 2006 to 10. And what do we find? The first study found out that the NREGA effectively worked as a minimum wage legislation. When the government gives a minimum wage for jobs or work opportunities, markets respond, which means they have to compete. So basically, we saw the real rural wages rise sharply in those 4 years. In states such as Andhra Pradesh, this is United Andhra Pradesh, real rural wages by almost 40%. That's a massive increase. That had a direct impact on poverty. So we saw NREGA have a direct impact on poverty levels, particularly in states such as Andhra. That's a state I studied very closely. After that, I did a second study, which tried to look at how does it impact choice of enterprises and what people actually do. And then we discovered something far more troubling, which is when the real wages rose by close to 40%, for many small and micro enterprises, labor costs became unsustainable, which meant that a lot of these small micro businesses themselves became unsustainable. So many small and micro enterprises were shut down because the wage costs just couldn't make sense. So now the cost of NREGA is not just what the government pays in the form of wages or the machinery, which is a relatively smaller. It's also the growth foregone because we have many micro enterprises shutting down and all those people getting back into casual labor. So the trade-offs are far, far more nuanced. It had an impact on poverty, but it also had an impact on growth. And therein lie a lot of the detailing, a lot of the work in policy making, which is not about obvious calculations. It requires layers and layers, and sometimes it requires time. Now, women have been at the heart of India's growth trajectory for a long time. But I'm here to also tell you that in Viksit Bharat 2047, which is the trajectory we are now following, women have a unique position. Almost all major welfare schemes have women at the heart of it. And there are many. Different forms of cash transfers, different kinds of enterprise development, etc., etc. Every ministry, in fact, I'm now going to tell you that the last I looked, 15 months back, 56 ministries of government of India is running some kind of cash transfer program, and a majority of them focused on women. Now, the question is, what is it leading to? And there is the political side of it, and we have published several articles to show what is happening to women. voters and how are they voting and so on. We have established that female voters are indeed very different from male voters, because this state offered a natural experiment setting. In 2005, when the state election was held, no party got majority. This was the February election. And for 6 months, there was no state government. It was under president's rule. And then in October, when the elections happened, you had the emergence of a single party as a majority. So what changed in those 6 months? That's why it's a natural experiment setting. And you study constituency by constituency what happened, and the singular factor which explains difference in the result is female voter turnout. In constituencies where female voter turnout was beyond a certain number, the probability of the incumbent candidate winning fell sharply. Women came out against the sitting candidates, while for men, it was mostly status quo. So men were voting to maintain the candidates in power. The women were voting to vote out the candidates in power. Therein lies the difference. It's a very simple, but it's a very significant statistical relationship, that women are not just following the orders or the advice of their male family members. They have a mind of their own, and this is 2005. Since then, you have seen election after election, right? And that is the political side of the story, which is why there is belief that India has entered a virtuous cycle of development and democracy on the back of female voters, because female voters want different things from their public representatives. They want development, they want access to public utilities, they want safety. So you are seeing responses. So if most of our welfare schemes today are focusing on women, there is a political side of the story. But very importantly, there is also an economic and a development side of the story. What is the outcome of all these policies? If I were to look at a singular measure as a development economist, I look at poverty levels. I look at Rangarajan poverty line. Rangarajan poverty line, unlike the Tendulkar poverty line, which was about food and caloric requirement, Tendulkar's was more about destitution. You didn't want people to die of hunger. But the Rangarajan poverty line subsequently is like moderate poverty. It's food, it's also health and education, but it's also housing and conveyance. It's about miscellaneous items, personal goods, etc. So we call it, it's higher than the $2.15 of the World Bank. Now, if you look at the Rangarajan poverty line, what has happened in India? If you compare the household consumption expenditure surveys of the last 12 years, in 2011-12, India had 29.5% poverty. As of the last household consumption expenditure survey, India has 3.9% poverty. It's a remarkable feat. In terms of absolute number, it amounts to 302 million people have been lifted out of poverty in India. This is nothing short of a miracle. Now, since I'm talking about women, I'm interested in women's poverty. So we have an EPW publication which came out 6 months back, where we look at intra-household allocation. And what you observe is female poverty in India today, of adult females, by the same Rangarajan poverty line, is 2%. So while all India is 3.9, women's poverty stands at 2. Effectively, India has eradicated female poverty. Poverty being measured as Rangarajan poverty line. Remarkable, because the other category is children. Children have also seen some of the biggest reductions in poverty. Adult men have seen relatively smaller reduction, right? So all these schemes, these transformations that you are seeing, is leading to advancement or improvement in the quality of life of an average citizen, and women in particular. Very quickly, because we are sitting in Bihar, whenever we speak of Bihar, it is usually to evoke a joint, a common sensibility of development failures. Bihar remains the poorest country in the poorest state in the country. In fact, the term Bimaru was largely inspired by this region, with Bihar at the center of it. And of course, while it is mildly offensive, I'm from Bihar, but it rings certain truth to it. But I'm here to also tell you that if you now study the data closely, which we've been doing in the last 10 years, Bihar has turned its fortunes around. In terms of just the poverty level that I have just explained to you, Bihar's poverty level today is lower than all its neighbors. Bihar's growth in consumption, monthly per capita consumption, is the highest in the region. It's far higher than national average, which stands around 3.1%. This is compound annual growth rate. Bihar is at 4.1 and 4.3%. All India is 3.1. In terms of development indicators like infant mortality, neonatal mortality, maternal mortality, Bihar's numbers are improving much faster, and in absolute terms, IMR, they are far superior to all their neighbors who have historically been richer than Biharis. If you look at child marriage, West Bengal is seeing a rise. Bihar has seen the biggest decline in child marriage. Now, please appreciate, development indicators do not transform overnight, and it is not the one scheme of a government which can do it. What Bihar has witnessed in the last 20 years is a silent transformation. Now, does it show up in the GDP numbers or the per capita GDP, which is what 99% economists are doing today? It does not. Yes, there is growth and GDP is also improving, but please appreciate, very large segment of Bihari population works, earns a living, and spends outside Bihar. Bihar is the youngest state in the country. So ideally, we should be looking at the GNP, not GDP, because the value creation is happening outside the state. Now imagine, we are going back to Economics 101. It's the earnings of Biharis outside of Bihar which is fueling a rapid increase in consumption of Biharis. So an average Bihari in rural India is superior to a Bengali in rural Bengal. Imagine the transformation. These are not quick things. These are silent transformations, but they are in many ways irreversible. Right? Therein lies the fact that if you do have a development orientation, Sachin, there is a way to grow where you do take the bottom 40% along. And again, if you just break down the poverty levels and consumption numbers by quintile groups, some of the fastest increases have been in the bottom 50% of rural Bihar, and Bihar is far more rural than, let's say, its neighboring states, West Bengal, etc. So those transformations are there. It's real time. It's happening all around us. I will end, because I am an empiricist, by saying that it's a very difficult time because our faith in institutions are being questioned every day. The rules-based order. One wonders, what are the rules that we are talking about when the real rule globally seems to be might is right? This is a time when I think the investment into multilaterals, investment into creating coalitions, particularly of the global south, because when the big guys fight, it's the small nations that suffer. Of course, the story here isn't about India. The story is about our entire neighborhood. Small nations are relatively homogeneous in terms of their economic activity. And shocks, COVID was a shock, but the subsequent shocks have dealt very big blows to our entire neighborhood. And it's very difficult to reverse or reduce the damage of these kind of shocks. So I think the investment into dialogues, the investment into thinking of development paradigms which go beyond the trickle-down version of growth, which is what we have inherited from the West, that needs to be questioned. A new model where true democracies are meant to live, it's meant to be inclusive. And if we are seeing this kind of transformation in the poorest region in India, there is no reason to believe that this larger lesson cannot be taken globally. The means to do it are also many today in the form of DPIs, in the form of newer ways and technological advancements have given us many of these tools, and we do have collaborations. In fact, 60 countries of the Global South have shown interest, and about 15 of them are actively deploying some version of the Indian DPI, the digital public infrastructure, whether it's an Aadhaar, a UPI, or whatever, right? So there are ways of doing it. Technology is making it relatively easier, simpler. But the advent of AI will mean that there are new uncertainties which are on the forefront. And again, democracies where livelihoods matter. This is why the growth of China cannot be replicated by us, even if we wanted to, at scale, because electoral democracies lend itself to real-time pressures. We cannot just abandon certain segments. We cannot put barriers to entry. Labor markets cannot be fragmented, rural to urban, north to south, etc. So I think development dialogue is a very welcome step. We are here to lend complete support, Sachin, to you, the platform, the university at large, not just through the PMEAC, but also through the Indian Economic Association, which I presided over the last 2 years. There's a large scholarly community out there which needs to be motivated to work in the interest of, I think, the larger global common good. So congratulations once again, and I wish you all the very best for future improvements and development of this platform itself. Congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for your insights reflecting on the importance of demography in our country's growth trajectory, stressing on the potential of women in contributing to our economy. To share the opening insights, I invite Professor Deepak Nair, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Sir, please.
Good morning, colleagues, students, and my friends on the podium, Sachin, Shamika, and Thomas. I consider it a privilege to be in your midst this morning. The theme of this opening plenary roundtable is rethinking and reframing the development agenda beyond 2015. This is in part about creating a post-2030 framework for development, but the program for our development dialogue suggests that it is just as important to recognize the impact of the shifts in the institutional and geopolitical context, the significance of rethinking multilateral agreements and governance models in a world that has recently changed beyond recognition, and the influence of technical progress as a driver of change in science, economy, and society. In my opening remarks, I will focus on this wider global context. In doing so, I will not attempt to join the little dots to create a skeleton yet fuzzy picture. Instead, I will sketch the big picture with bold strokes on a white canvas so that we can see the wood from the trees. At the end of World War II, which brought destruction and chaos across the globe, the United States sought to construct a new world order that was largely in place by the late 1940s. It was based on international institutions, rules, and practices in a quest for broadly free international markets, essentially underwritten by American economic strength and military power. This world order, which spanned 75 years, was not without its limitations and flaws. Yet, it managed to preserve the peace between the superpowers uh, in the Cold War era and broadly in the world as a whole uh, during the 1990s and 2000s, although it struggled to cope thereafter. There were, of course, geographically bound conflicts in which big nations lost small wars. It was also conducive to decades of rapid economic growth, unprecedented in human history, beginning with the post-war economic reconstruction, gathering momentum in the era of markets and globalization, starting in the 1980s, which improved living standards for ordinary people in the industrial north and lifted billions out of poverty in the global south, although it was associated with a rapid transformative increase in economic inequalities between countries and people. Now, this world order was under increasing stress, beginning with the global financial crisis in late 2008 and the Great Recession that followed in its aftermath. Financial crises dented faith in markets. Mounting economic inequalities created social and political discontents among people. International institutions creaked at the seams. The IMF and the World Bank failed to reinvent themselves for changed times. The WTO came to a dead end. The United Nations system, which had lost its way much earlier, was neither credible nor effective, even if the world sorely needed such an institution for its designated critical roles. Globalization was at risk. Economies were going through difficult times, spilling over into crises with growth slowdowns, double-digit inflation, persistent unemployment. Politics within countries became contentious, if not polarized. The geopolitical divides were visible and sharper than they have been for decades. International relations were strained, and there were several flashpoints. This period also witnessed a discernible change in the balance of global economic power, which exacerbated the stress. The past decade was indeed a most difficult economic and political conjuncture for the world. For a world order already under stress, much worse was yet to come. Donald Trump assumed office as President of the United States in January 2025. The 1 year since then has turned out to be a watershed movement. The world order that was created by the United States circa 1945, embedded in institutions, rules, norms, and practices underwritten by American power, has been dismantled by the decisions of President Trump in 2025 in just 12 months. The unilateral tariffs, which differentiated between countries and buried a comatose WTO, were a death blow to the multilateral trading system, replacing it with a transactional unilateralism that borders on mercantilism almost everywhere. Restrictions on international movements of services, technology, and finance have mounted across countries. The irony is that the United States, a country that championed globalization, has brought it to an abrupt end. In the political sphere, an impotent United Nations is not relevant anymore, as its peacekeeping role, whether Ukraine or the Gaza Strip, has been assumed by President Trump. Security alliances such as NATO have been reshaped as mere transactional relationships. The sovereignty of nations, whether Greenland, Nigeria, Palestine, Venezuela, or Iran, is no longer sacrosanct. It would seem that we have returned to a world of 19th century imperialism where might is right. Geopolitics is also characterized by a transactional approach to international relations, often reflected in bilateral or plurilateral bargaining, and there are many great games that are being played out. The erstwhile world order under stress has come to an abrupt end. Are we then entering a world where every nation is for itself? In my view, the consequences would be dire. For one, it would be an unequal world in which the poor, weak, or small countries will be at the mercy of the rich, strong, and large countries. For another, it'll be a world characterized by conflict, if not chaos. Even if a fragmented, even such a fragmented and divided world order will need some rudimentary framework for international consultation, cooperation, and collective action, at least in some critical domains. Now, the raison d'etre of any world order is simple. National laws would suffice if economic space coincides broadly with geographical space. However, in the contemporary world, economic space extends much beyond geographical or political space. Moreover, conflicts or wars between countries arise from the pursuit of perceived national interests by governments. But countries are not subject to international laws because there is no world government or parliament that can enact laws binding on nations. Obviously, creating rules or laws that are binding on sovereign nation states, which implies ceding national sovereignty in some aspects, is difficult since it is subject to mutual acceptance. Yet, a world order as a broadly acceptable framework is both necessary and desirable, I believe, to preserve global public goods such as peace, environment, or human health, and regulate global public bads such as wars, environmental degradation, and pandemics. In recent times, the existing world order has simply been unable to perform such a role. Examples abound. The Russia-Ukraine war, which started in early 2022, continues with no end in sight. The Israel-Hamas conflict on the Gaza Strip ended by sacrificing the interests of Palestine altogether. But the United States-Israel war with Iran has shattered the fragile peace in the Middle East. Now, such wars or conflicts might be localized, but if they continue or others elsewhere proliferate, and there are many, they are bound to have global impact. Alas, there is no credible or effective institutional mechanism in the world that could help restore peace. Environmental degradation and climate change stare us in the face. There are more frequent occurrences across the world of forest fires, floods, droughts, excess rainfall, rising sea levels, receding glaciers, temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius in Germany, in Beijing, in India we are used to them, in the southern United States, everywhere. Or wet bulb temperatures at which humans cannot survive, and so on. Humankind, it seems to me, is mortgaging its future. In every sphere, the poor and the marginalized are more vulnerable, but the rich are not immune. Yet, effective progress is much too slow. The global coronavirus pandemic turned the world upside down. We all lived through it for 2 years with a death toll of 7 million people worldwide. It was simply not recognized that problems without passports need solutions without passports. Instead, at a time when international cooperation and collective action was an imperative, the response of governments was driven by perceived national interests, erecting national barriers to international travel, despite the knowledge that microbes, germs, and viruses will inevitably cross borders, or accumulating vaccines when so many people in other countries remain unvaccinated. The most effective response would have been international cooperation instead of a myopic pursuit of illusory national interests. Clearly, governments simply do not have the willingness or the ability to coordinate and implement the much needed collective action to preserve global public goods and to regulate global public bads. The erstwhile world order was neither effective nor credible. Yet, the combination of market failure in the sphere of economics and government failure in the realm of politics made it exceedingly difficult to reform, let alone reconstruct this order. Sadly, the present world disorder is going to make things much worse. Alas, the reluctance of governments to explore the possibilities of international collective action has been exacerbated by the widespread resurgence of nationalisms. In the West, National conservative political parties are in office as governments or as a part of coalition governments or close contestants for political power in elections to come. Similarly, a significant number of countries in the global south, populist authoritarian political parties or leaders, often elected through democratic process, articulate their strong belief in nationalism. Inevitably, such political ideologies stress their perception of national interest, sometimes also associated with a growing militarism. It reminds me of the early 1930s. It is no surprise that such governments also shun the idea of international cooperation, for it is perceived as ceding space in terms of national sovereignty. Experience suggests that building a consensus to address cross-national and cross-domain challenges is increasingly difficult, more difficult, so apparent in the slow progress and the struggle with climate change negotiations, let alone efforts at preserving peace in the world. Therefore, the future prospect to me is even more worrisome. Aging populations, demographic imbalances, food shortages, water securities, and recurring pandemics are new challenges confronting our world. Their economic consequences might reinforce nationalisms, xenophobic attitudes, or even militarism. The possible impact of profound technological changes on the horizon, say artificial intelligence, only adds to the complexity and the uncertainty. The present world order is confronted with another fundamental problem. The period 1970 to 2024, roughly half a century, witnessed profound changes in the balance of economic power. A rapid economic decline of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, the rise and fall of Japan, an economic recovery in Western Europe until 2005, followed by a significant decline, now absolute, that has gathered momentum starting 2010, continued economic dominance of the West until 2000, and the steady rise of the global South as its share of world GDP rose from around 20% in 2000 to almost 40% in 2024, attributable entirely to Asia, in particular China. The significance of the United States, and please note this is important, with its share at more than 25% of world GDP throughout from 1945 to 2025, was perhaps the only reality that did not change. The rise of Asia, especially China, has slowly chipped away at the economic dominance and political hegemony of the United States and Western Europe. But I want to emphasize, the story is about much more than China. In 2024, the share of China in world GDP was 16.5%, while that of the rest of Asia, excluding Japan, was 16%. So the rest of Asia is almost as large as China, taken together as almost as large as China. Now, we must also recognize that the resurgence of Asia, except for China, is not large enough to shift the hegemonic balance. The United States remains the dominant economic, political, and military power in the world. And even if it no longer seeks a proactive role in preserving or in creating a world order, because its domestic political constituencies are not supportive of the idea, there is no country yet that could replace the United States in this hegemonic role. Indeed, it is plausible to suggest, and I am perhaps Machiavellian in this respect, that Donald Trump, who believes that the erstwhile world order was no longer serving the interests of the United States, is seeking to resurrect the dominance of the United States by changing the rules of the game in a world that has witnessed profound changes during the first quarter of the 21st century. For there is an important lesson that emerges from history. We can go back centuries. Dominant powers are reluctant to cede economic or political space to newcomers that are rising empires. Go back to the early 20th century. Both Germany and Japan were rising powers that were latecomers to industrialization and empire. However, Britain and the United States were not willing to accommodate them in this framework, and it led to 2 world wars. In principle, the idea of multilateralism provided the foundations of the erstwhile world order, established circa 1945. In practice, however, from the perspective of the global South, it was characterized not only by asymmetrical rules, but also by a democratic deficit, a huge, yawning deficit. Most countries in Asia, remember circa 1945, were de jure or de facto colonies. While Latin America, no longer colonized, most countries got independence in the early 19th century, was under strong American influence. So that these continents had no voice in the design of that world order. It is no accident that the rules were unequal and unfair. In contrast, the present world economic and political disorder is both a challenge and an opportunity for the global South. It is a challenge simply because in an unequal world, unfair rules of the past may be preferable to the no rules in the present, particularly for the countries that are economically poor, politically weak, and geographically small. It is an opportunity because developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, which account for almost 40% of world income and more than 80% of world population, if only they could set aside their differences, rivalry, and conflicts, they could exercise a significant influence on the conception and design of a new world order during a prolonged interregnum, which I think will stretch until 2050, if not longer. It will be a prolonged interregnum. The cohesion and solidarity that is needed, that is a necessary condition for capturing this opportunity, sadly, is missing. But that is also missing among countries in the rich West. You look at the US and Europe today. China aspires for superpower status. Russia seeks a seat at the high table. And it's a messy world. Yeah? Even so, there is a window of opportunity that will be available to the global South, much as I don't like that phrase or description, over the next 2 decades. In the pursuit of this objective, I believe the global South, much like a child, must learn to walk together before it can run together. It'll have to be a sequence of small steps that could become building blocks to make this feasible in the longer term, even if it's not attainable in the short run. Now, let me engage in some loud thinking in terms of an analytical abstraction. Let's think of what the Global South can do in terms of institutional mechanisms, in terms of stages of getting together, in terms of sectors across which they could try and cooperate. You know, if we think of institutional mechanisms, I think there are successive stages of consultation, listening to each other, of cooperation, attempting to do some things together, and ultimately collective action. If we think of stages, then we could begin with the bilateral and plurilateral within continents, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and we have the seeds of it. We could then try and go plurilateral across continents, and ultimately multilateral by sectors, and the Global South has a strong interest in a framework that governs the cross-border movement of people, given demographic imbalances that are going to characterize the world. Sectors, it's obvious, trade, investment, development assistance, technological cooperation, climate action, cross-border movements of people, and so on. Yeah? Now, I think in each of these, whether it's institutional mechanisms or stages or sectors, there has to be the strongest possible emphasis on mutual interests, yeah, while mutual conflicts have to be put on the back burner. Yeah? And whoever the actors in this consultation, cooperation, collective action are, must seek the highest common factor rather than the lowest common multiple. Now, you know, if we are thinking that this could go global, we have to think of institutional mechanisms, stages, and sectors in parallel in order to and proceed in order of feasibility rather than desirability, because the best can be the enemy of the good. We can think of these as sequential steps or building blocks towards the multilateralization of agreements. We can think of cooperation and collective action, plurilateral or multilateral agreements within continents, across continents, as a means of providing a collective voice for the global south in any process of multilateral negotiations working towards international agreements. Now, what I have said in terms of my sort of imagined analytical construct is the concern largely of governments alone. And governments can be inept, they can be domineering, they can be incompetent, you know, things could go any which way. There is also, I believe, a role in this for people like us, for those who are intellectuals in some way, or public intellectuals, that we need to think. Once upon a time in the early 1950s, there was a development consensus, which evolved largely from the ideas of economists in the West, but about how development would proceed in the so-called undeveloped world. And with the passage of time, as it led to more failures and successes, the development consensus came to be discredited by the early 1980s, and it was in the early 1990s replaced by the Washington consensus. And that Washington consensus was, in effect, a neoliberal, multilateral institution-driven, largely US-driven construct. That, too, came to be discredited. Now, we are, in that sense, we are in a vacuum. I mean, there are people somebody is trying to develop a Beijing consensus. Nick Stern and colleagues at the London School of Economics are trying to develop a London consensus. They've just published a book. But I think the time has come for the global South, its thinkers, its intellectuals, and I'm sure there were the Hans Singers of the world then, the Thomas Pogges of the world now. There will be many people in the West who would collaborate with us in trying to develop such a consensus. And I think what I said first is important because any kind of evolution of consultation, cooperation, or collective action has to be on the part of governments. But it will not happen in a vacuum. That vacuum has to be filled by people who have ideas, who will think. And I do believe that, Sachin said this at the outset, that, social sciences are strange. We have divided ourselves with high, strong walls between disciplines. So economists have an imperialism. Nobody else is a social scientist. Only economists are. Now, the point is, if you look at life sciences, you look at natural sciences, knowledge is developing at the intersection of disciplines. And I believe that even in the social sciences, knowledge is developing at the intersection of disciplines that will include history and philosophy, that will include humanities. And I think that economists in particular need to reinvent themselves because they think other social sciences are not social sciences. Now, Thomas and I may be exceptions to that rule, but that is the way the mainstream of the profession works. So perhaps the time has come for us to think of a way forward in terms of using development studies as an anchor, as it were, to exploit the intersections of social sciences. So let me leave you with these two thoughts. what governments can do and what people like us can do. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Nair, for your thought-provoking insights on the changing global order and the necessity for an international framework to respond better to today's challenges. I now invite Professor Thomas Boge, Director of the Global Justice Program and Leitner Professor of Philosophy and International Affairs at Yale University, to share his remarks. Sir.
Yeah, they're putting up the slide. Good.
Oh. So I can move it forward myself, right? Okay, super. Good, so I'll start with the preamble that economics serves three masters. There is a tension between three purposes that it pursues. One is we try to understand human economic behavior. We are trying to fulfill human needs, so it has an important normative function. And finally, and also importantly, economics also serves to rationalize social structures, distributions of wealth and power, and political decisions. And obviously, these three things are often in tension with each other. And to understand what economists do, we have to understand what purpose they are pursuing, what they're getting paid for often, and so on. Now, economics, or economic science, as it likes to call itself, is quantifying a lot. They deal a lot with numbers. And sometimes when we use numbers to measure things, we measure things simply because we are interested in their magnitude. We are interested in how old something is, how large something is, and so on. But often, and in economics very often, we are using measurements in order really to get at something else, something that we cannot directly measure, but we're using something else as a proxy, as an indicator. Now, the most important measure that we use in economics is gross national income, or also GDP. A number of people, I know in detail the difference between those two magnitudes, but they will not matter for purposes of this lecture. So we look at GDP or GNI, we look at GNI per capita, and we look at growth rates in both these two quantities. And those are very important parameters in terms of which we look at countries, compare countries over time, and so on. The most important, most common measures. And they are measures for the society's development, as we say, its economic strength, its progress, its vitality. That is what we are really trying to get at with these measures. I will try to kill a few mosquitoes as I speak. Now, GNI and GDP are insensitive to distribution. That's very important. So we are looking at the total of what a country produces without, or the total income that is generated in a country without regard to how it's distributed. All the four measures that I mentioned do that. They aggregate all this income into one big whole. The four measures being GNI, GNI per capita, growth in GNI, and growth in GNI per capita. Now, GNI, or gross domestic product, whatever, is used to cover two very different things. And that explains, I think, why that measure refuses to die. And on the one hand, it measures how well a society meets its members' needs. That's one important thing that we are trying to capture with, in particular, GNI per capita. But it also measures that same society's economic potential relative to other societies. So how much economic power could a country mobilize in an emergency, Pearl Harbor or COVID? How internationally competitive is that society? And these are two very different things. GNI is unsuitable for both, but it is much more unsuitable for the first function than the second. It is sort of roughly suitable for the second function, and that is the reason, I think, why it persists in economic discourse to the extent that it does. Now, what sets apart these two different functions, these two different things that we use GNI as a proxy for, is distribution. So think of the energy that a society produces and how that energy is distributed within that society, right? Many people don't have electricity at all. Some people use a lot of electricity, or maybe everybody has electricity, and so on. Now, this question, how electricity consumption is distributed, is highly relevant to how well a society meets the needs of its members. But it isn't very relevant at all to the question of how competitive that society is relative to other societies. So this sets apart the two different things that we use GNI as a proxy for, namely, the one thing is highly distribution relevant or sensitive, the other one isn't. So that already tells you that we shouldn't be using the same proxy, GNI, for these two roles, the internal role of checking whether society meets the needs of its people, and the external role of assessing how competitive that society is relative to others. Now, even as a proxy for international competitiveness, where GNI is a better measure, a better proxy, GNI is still defective. And is defective in its valuation, for example, of the production of luxury goods and services. Think of super expensive Gucci handbags or first-class flights or very expensive wines or something like that. They are valued very, very highly. They contribute a lot to GNI, in particular in France, but they are not a very good indicator of how competitive France is, how much it could mobilize by way of resources in an emergency. Another case where we severely undervalue is the quality of child rearing and schooling. These are activities that are mostly done by women. We've already celebrated International Women's Day this morning, and I will do it again. We have a tremendous amount of very important work that is being done largely by women in child rearing within the family, and also by underpaid, often underpaid women doing primary and secondary school education. And that work is just tremendously important for international competitiveness of a society. It builds up cultural and human capital, and it is valued within the GNI proxy only in proportion to how much pay is being given. Of course, most care work in the household isn't paid at all, so it doesn't show up in GNI at all. So here we are grossly mismeasuring what we really want to measure, namely the capacity of a society, the competitiveness of a society. Two other examples of the same sort are gains in infrastructure capital. So it matters a lot whether activities that happen in a society go into building up infrastructure, for example. China built an enormous network of fast trains recently that are there and are going to empower people in China, saving them a lot of time, for example. Or whether money goes into consumption expenditure, such as the Gucci handbags and Hermes and Versace and so on. And gains in innovative capacity. Again, building up the capacity to innovate is a tremendous indicator, is a tremendously important for a society's capacity to compete with other societies, even though it is valued only in proportion to the money that is being spent on it. Now let's get to GNI in its internal role. And here I just want to reiterate again how grotesquely inadequate GNI is, or GNI per capita is, for measuring how well a society does in meeting the needs of its people. So think about a 10% income gain and what that does if it's enjoyed by 1,000 poor households. Each of them now has 10% more income. They go from 8,000 rupees a month to 8,800 rupees a month. And compare that with exactly the same gain where two households, much richer households, go from 40 lakhs to 44. That's the same amount of rupees added to the economy, but of course it makes an enormous difference whether we get the one gain or the other gain in terms of human needs fulfillment. From the point of view of GNI, these two things are indistinguishable, but if we are interested in how well a society meets the needs of its members, then the first is vastly, vastly greater than the second. Now think again, another thought experiment, think about a poor household's 10% income gain versus a 10% income gain for a rich household. Those two are very close in importance to each other. It's not clear that the larger income gain that comes from a 10% gain for the richer household does more for satisfying human needs than the 10% income gain of the poorer household. If anything, you might say it's the other way around, that the poorer household gains more in terms of needs fulfillment from a 10% income gain, even though that income gain is much smaller in terms of the rupees that are added to the economy. So that suggests that it would be much more appropriate to think of, to measure income on a logarithmic scale, and I'll return to that point in a bit. Now, innovations were introduced. An Indian economist, Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, introduced the Human Development Report together with Mahbub ul Haq, a Pakistani economist. And that became the dominant way to measure development for a couple of decades, the UN Human Development Reports and so on and so forth. But it reproduced the GNI's distribution insensitivity in two of its three components. So it recorded for each society the average life expectancy without looking at how that life expectancy is distributed, for example, over the different classes of society, right? It makes a big difference, intuitively speaking, whether poor people in a country live to roughly 53 years and the rich people live to 90, or whether in the same society the poor people live to 68 and the rich live to 72. But the measure, the Human Development Index, was indifferent between those two options and basically just aggregated, averaged out the life expectancy. And it did exactly the same thing for income. It accumulated all the income just exactly as GNI does, and it then formed the average income and put that average income on a logarithmic scale. And again, it doesn't matter whether the income is very unequally distributed or equally distributed, because it all gets thrown into the same pot, added up, and only then is it converted into a logarithm. Now, you can see the same sort of problem in the Gender Development Index that was then added a few years later. And the gender inequality, or the Gender Development Index, is basically constructs a gender inequity penalty where you calculate the HDI separately for males and females and then penalize the GDI is lower than the HDI, reflecting the extent to which there is a discrepancy between the male and the female populations, each independently evaluated. Now, again, that gives equal value to each dollar or each rupee, if you like, but not equal value to each person. The quickest way to see that is on this diagram here. Hypothetical diagram, you have two different scenarios, two different futures of the same society, if you like. And you can see that these two societies get exactly the same gender penalty for inequality. Namely, what you have here is women earn on average only 40, well, in total, only 45% of the total. You have equal numbers of men and women in the society. 45% of the income goes to the women, 55% goes to the men. And that determines the gender inequity penalty. What is completely left out of account is how that is distributed. You can see here in the first scenario on the left, it is the women are severely disadvantaged across 90% of the population. So in the bottom 90% of the population, men are substantially better paid, have a substantially greater income than women. In the second scenario on the right-hand side, that problem doesn't exist. The bottom 90%, men and women are roughly equally well off, but in the top decile, that's where there is a significant advantage for males. And because the top decile is so much richer than the other deciles, that advantage that males have in the top decile compensates fully for the advantage that in scenario 1, the males have in the bottom 9 deciles, right? So again, this is completely wrong-headed. Here we have 90% of women doing much worse in the first scenario, being under the thumb of their male relatives because they have a great income disadvantage. And that should be equal to a disadvantage that only 10% suffer, and in particular 10% who are already relatively well off and can more or less fend for themselves pretty well. That seems intuitively completely implausible from the point of view of needs and point of view of power distribution, but that is how the GDI was constructed. So what we need to do, I think, is we need to give equal weight to persons. We need to focus on persons rather than on dollars. Instead of asking what proportion of dollars go to men and to women, we have to ask how advantaged or disadvantaged are women. Give equal weight to each woman, irrespective of how much income that woman has. Now, economies also produce harms, of course, and that's recently come much more into focus as the ecological crisis has exacerbated. The harms are of many different forms. We have greenhouse gas emissions. We have other pollution-caused harms, in particular to health. For example, heavy metals, pesticides, and microplastics and so on that are now pervading our environment. We have the depletion of non-renewable resources, the loss of natural beauty, the loss of biodiversity, and various harms to animals and plants. Now, increasingly, as we talk about development, we recognize that we have to somehow bring in these harms, and that has caused people to develop ideas. Limits of growth is, of course, an older concept that goes back to the 1980s. A new movement is the degrowth movement, and then we have donut economics as a variation on that. And the idea is always that we have to somehow limit growth, but there's not a lot of specificity and precision about what exactly we are supposed to measure or limit and what exactly the growth is that we are here talking about. The assumption is, in all these different exercises, that constraining the harms an economy produces places limits on the benefits that the economy can deliver. But is that really true? Look at this typical, this is by Kate Rayworth, the donut economics. And what you see here is a very plausible idea, namely that we want certain things that are represented in the inner circle, certain things that are important for human needs fulfillment, and then we want to avoid certain things that are written down on the outside of the donut. And the idea is that there is some sort of a gradient. There can be too much of a good thing, right? We want to get up to a certain point, and then there is a nice green zone, and then, but we don't want to go any farther. Now, what's totally wrong about that picture is that there is a single dimension in terms of which we can have enough of a good thing and then too much of a good thing if we go further out. If you look at the details of this donut diagram, which is not even mine, it's her own diagram, you can see we are talking about totally different things. This arrow here in two directions, shortfall and overshoot, suggests that there is a single thing, a single dimension in terms of which we have maybe too little, maybe just right, or maybe too much. But of course, there isn't a single such dimension. These are very different things, right? Having clean drinking water is one thing, ocean acidification is a different thing. So there isn't that one dimension in terms of which we have to find the sweet spot between too little and too much. So it's not a case of too much of a good thing. What we should do, I think, is we should toss out that donut diagram, and we should think of these limits, these harms that we want to avoid. Again, we should incorporate them into an account of need. We need a multidimensional conception of human needs that includes, among such things as clean water and food and clothing and so on, also the need for clean air, for a healthy diet, i.e. healthy food that is not contaminated by microplastics and mercury and other undesirable pesticides and so forth. We need to be protected from extreme weather events and from extreme heat, of course, as we just heard. People need to live in a temperature where they can survive. Now, that sort of project we should engage in. I think this was Sachin's question at the beginning. You know, how do we think about development over the next few decades? What comes under 2030? We need some sort of a multidimensional conception of development based on a conception of human needs. And here, the fundamental thing that we haven't yet managed to do, that the GNI gets wrong, that the Human Development Index and the Gender Development Index get wrong, is the order of aggregation. That is what is the central message that I'm trying to convey here, that we've always gone the red route here. We have looked at various indicators. We have aggregated across each indicator, sort of across the whole population for each indicator. And then we have performed the second aggregation, where we have aggregated the different dimensions into a single overall measure of development. So that's Human Development Index does that. It has longevity, education, and income as the three dimensions. It aggregates in each of those three dimensions, and then it aggregates across persons. And what we need to do, I think, is we need to go the blue route. We need to aggregate in the opposite order. We have to first aggregate across dimensions for each person and figure out how well off that person is, how well are the needs of that person met. And we then aggregate these aggregates into a single measure for the level of society of the person. Now, how to do that leads us too far afield. I close here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Professor Deepak Nair, and thanks, Shamika. I think this was an extremely exciting session, which has set broad contours of our discussions in the day. Very exciting panel is to take over in a while from now. Since Shamika has to leave, I thought I would just quickly open the floor for any observations, clarifications addressed to all the three deliberations which were there. The point that Thomas just made towards closing in terms of multidimensional thinking of new development model that he emphasized. Professor Deepak Nair closed by this idea of the kind of global South consensus that we should have, who would be and where we should look for hand singers of the world. The point that he left and his indication was more towards Thomas, who gave us the donut and the very nice donut figurative description in terms of how we are going to go forward. But role of women in the development, the local economic challenges that Bihar has, but also multiple dimensions of these engagements that Shamika Ravi has identified. So floor is open for your quick clarification, intervention, observation, and then in next few minutes at 11:30 sharp, we begin the next panel. Thank you.
We are opening the floor for questions.
Hello. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Ravi Kant from Department of Economics. Ma'am rightly said that two things, that is demography and technology are the main players in this centuries. And you rightly told about how the incentives are given to the women's. Ma'am, regarding this, I want one clarifications that what institutional supports are needed to reap the demographic dividend of women. And the second thing is that for India to be Viksit Bharat by 2047, India must effectively reap its demographic dividend. So what are the government plans regarding this?
Good morning to all the panelists. My name is Shirsha Gupta. I am from the Department of International Relations and Peace Studies. My question is to Professor Nair. So you mentioned about the Global South Consensus, the South-South cooperation, and moving away from the Washington Consensus. What I wanted to ask is that in this world where we are seeing so many changes geopolitically and consequently economically as well, how feasible do you think is India's rise as an economic power in the global south possible by 2030 or 2047 for that matter?
Just a very quick observation. So I came from the regional dialogue, although I attended only 2 sessions. But later I heard from the Christian that there was a very nice discussion, very contending. But so my observation here is, these 3 talks are very harmonious, very, very Nalanda. So thank you very much.
Just to add to what Professor Samika has said about I'm saying women's mobilization through NRJ in Andhra, the undivided Andhra earlier. There is also a benefit which you have, many studies have brought in. It's all about the mobilization capital, particularly for the women. It's tremendous in many of the programs, particularly in Andhra also we have visited. So that participation and mobilization capital as a benefit, I think, can be examined and factored in. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting observations. And I agree with you. But one of the challenges, particularly most of the emerging economies, is they are somehow trapped in this middle income trap. And for example, when we are looking for the 2045 and then the time horizon, and we are looking for the high income country. And I believe, still I believe that education is an important role to play down. So what will be your opinion about this role of education, that the trajectory that is we need to move in? And for example, that China has adopted a very industrial vocational oriented policy that benefited, but it is not fully. On the other hand, emerging economies in the Southeast Asia, they adopted an export oriented model, basically with the limited input on the innovations. So what could be the trajectory for the emerging economies to avoid this middle income track and attain that prosperity or the high income tax zone, I think, within the 30 years period?
Thank you, Professor Poge, for bringing that ecological dimension to this discourse. And I think in all the consensus that Professor Nair talked about, it was this dimension that was always missing, whether it is development consensus or Washington or even Beijing. And Professor Nair also indicated that not only ecological, but even other domains, other domain knowledge are also missing from this development consensus. Now, I would like to ask you, how would you propose that we take this forward, that this can become mainstream into a consensus that we can build, so that all these dimensions are taken together? Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe I'll speak briefly on the demographic dividend and the middle income trap. India has a young population, of course. We also have 120 million people above the age of 60. So it's important to recognize that, yes, the median age is 28 point something, but very rapidly it is also transforming. There are certain idiosyncrasies of the Indian labor market which I think we must acknowledge. One is the fact that traditionally, over a long term, and for me long term, let's say 20, 30 years, we have had relatively low labor force participation, right? Compared to, let's say, China, Vietnam, even Bangladesh, India's labor force participation is not 60 yet, right? It was below 50 for a very long time, which tells you that half the population is neither working age population, is neither working nor looking for employment or looking for work, which is bizarre because how do you, we're talking of Vikasit Bharat, becoming a developed nation, while half the working age population is neither working nor looking for work. So then you have to parse out the data and then you begin to understand women are at the heart of that low labor force, in which we discussed in greater detail. But there are other kinds of idiosyncrasies. One in particular, which I think is a big concern, is the concept of graduate unemployment. The more educated you are in the Indian labor market, amongst the youth, the less likely you are to be working. So the unemployment rate of people under 30 who have graduate and above education is nearly 5 times that of people who have school education. But that totally flips this concept of education on its head. But we were told you better get educated if you want a good job. But now it means the more educated I am, the more likely I am to, number one, wait for the right job, because now I'm a degree holder, and hence I need a job which is commensurate with my status. But the markets are very quickly moving away from rewarding a degree to rewarding actual skills. And that's why this urgency around skilling, why we need to make people employable, because the new kinds of jobs are very different from the kind our education system has traditionally produced for, right? Which is filtering people for certain kinds of services and so on and so forth. So that's a very large part of the problem. But there are also other issues. For instance, in many of our states, there is a unhealthy obsession with government jobs, right? People leaving well-paying private corporate jobs to go into the government. And again, a very wonderful study that came out of Tamil Nadu, because they froze the recruitment for 4 years, so it became a natural experiment. And they found out that the cohort which spent more than X number of years preparing for a government job, their lifetime earnings was lower than the cohort which basically just joined the labor market. Which means there is real attrition, there is value being lost when our youth are spending their entire 20s taking exams for a government job. These kind of phenomena, they are limited. They're limited to some countries. It is definitely something significant here. And in some part of the country, it's much more severe. Now, the the green shoots, or the wonderful signs, if you read the data closely, is that the youth are now more risk-taking in the western, southern, etc. parts of the country too. So startups, using technology for age-old problems of health, agriculture, education, etc. These are some of the fastest growing sectors. Ag-tech, health tech, ed-tech, etc. And these almost all these people who have started these new businesses are folks under the age of 40. So there is an entrepreneurial sort of class which is emerging. We have had them in mostly traditional setups. But these are structural issues. I don't think these will have quick fixes. But new education policy, which is meant to take the classroom onto the shop floor and the factories into the classroom, so that kind of a skilling and bringing in more flexibility, more research and development activities, etc. All of that is meant to make the labor market much more amenable to this vision of 2047. On the middle income tribe, let me say, I'm going to be very pragmatic here, and I'm sure the government doesn't hold this view, but as an economist, being stuck as a middle income is not such a bad idea if you are talking from where we are today. And many countries, again, I too am not a big fan of the term global south, but if you think that economies can grow to the status of, let's say, $12,000, $15,000 per capita, that's not such a bad outcome to talk about, rather than spook yourself to, a trap emerging, right? So I think, middle income, and particularly high middle income, let's say where China is a nice position to be in. Of course, they are beginning to slow down on account of multiple other factors and trade constraints, etc. But unlike a lot of export-driven markets, India's GDP, if you break it up, 67% is domestic consumption, is private consumption. We are an economy where the domestic market is a very major driver of economic growth, right? So while export sector is being talked of constantly, it is an engine of growth. We continue to try and reform it, but we are not going to be impacted by global factors in trade the way, let's say, China or a Vietnam or a Mexico, which are fundamentally export-led markets. So domestic demand-driven economy. Unlike, let's say, China, where domestic demand is 32, 33%, right? Where the rest of it is either with the state or corporations. You have to break up the GDP to understand what is driving these different economies. So yeah, that's a short answer.
Yeah, so I'm answering the last question that you raised about, how do we get there? And basically what I would say, we get there in 2 steps. The first step is an argument where we say that these effects of our economy, the negative, harmful effects on the environment, they are externalities that need to be internalized. So we use the good old economic phrasing in terms of market distortion, market failure. This has to be priced in. And so we have to make sure that the fossil fuel industry, for example, and those people who consume it pay for the true cost. And what we now have in the world as it is, we have a $7 trillion subsidy, according to the IMF, which is doing a study every 2 years or so. And of those $7 trillion a year, about 1/4 is direct subsidies, where either consumption or production of fossil fuels is subsidized. The other 3/4 are subsidies that are indirect, where the healthcare costs, for example, on people are not internalized. The fossil fuel companies basically get to pollute for free, and the fossil fuel consumers. So we have to end that. Now, the next step that I would introduce would be to say that we should not just internalize the economic costs. So when somebody gets sick, for example, how much of a wage loss is that, or how much does that diminish productivity in society? But we should equalize across persons, and we should say that a lost year of life, for example, suffered by a poor person counts for as much as a lost year of life of a rich person or richer person, regardless of what their annual incomes might be. And then, of course, the cost that are imposed by fossil fuels, for example, are even much higher than what the IMF is calculating. So the fact is that green technologies, green ways of producing energy today and across several sectors are in fact already cheaper. We can already produce energy more cheaply, drive cars more cheaply, whatever, than we can do with fossil fuels. And fossil fuels remain in existence through the fact that they are artificially subsidized in these indirect and direct ways. And if you ask, why is that happening? That's really the crucial question. It's happening because of massive lobbying, right? What we have in the US, as you know, politics is for sale more than anywhere else in the world, and billions of dollars are spent by corporations and by billionaires on making politicians pliable, and they give billions, and then the state gives hundreds of billions in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry and related industries in order to keep a way of producing energy that is already obsolete economically, to keep it artificially alive. So the root cause has to be addressed, and we are working on that very hard. We are trying to overturn Citizens United, the Supreme Court judgment that cemented essentially unlimited campaign contributions for political action committees. And without that, we will not be able to change policy in the United States, but of course policy can be changed in other countries in other ways that I'm less well equipped to talk about in detail.
We are already past 11:30. I will do my best to be brief. Two questions. You know, your question reminds me of a conversation I had in the late 1970s with Hans Singer, Raoul Prebisch, and Dudley Sayers, where all of them deeply disillusioned with their endeavor to create a North-South dialogue, described it as a dialogue of the deaf. So they turned to me and said, Deepak, what do you think? I was very young then. What do you think of the idea of South-South cooperation? I said, I think it is a search of the blind. Now, it is 50 years since then. The world has changed. I think there is a challenge that comes from the crisis in the world order, and there's an opportunity that comes from the economic strength of what we call the global south, right? In terms of its share of the population, global population, in terms of its share of world GDP, 2/5 and 4/5 is not small. It was a very different picture then. What is more, there is a vacuum. Now, I think, how do we make the desirable feasible? It has to be at two levels, as I said. It has to be governments, and there are initiatives in this respect. It has to be governments that kind of grab this opportunity in a proactive way to search for what they have in common, rather than to always emphasize their differences. And at the same time, I believe it is important for social sciences from the global south, and indeed social sciences also from the industrial north, who have concerns about disparities in human development to begin to think what kind of construct will make it feasible. After all, the world order may have been created by Roosevelt, but a lot of people, whether it was John Maynard Keynes or Harry Dexter White or Bretton Woods, people who worked on the idea of an international trade organization, the idea of a United Nations to replace the League of Nations, a lot of other inputs went into it. So I think it is plausible and it is possible. Whether it is probable, I don't know. It will depend on how we respond to this. On your question about the middle income trap, I think the middle income trap is real. If we look at the experience of development, there are only a few countries that have escaped the middle income trap, and that's the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China is almost there, all right? But I don't think that the transition that say, Russia, Chile, or Guyana have made is a real transition, yeah? Because Russia is there essentially because of oil. Its per capita income levels are just above the World Bank threshold for high income. And Chile, again, is commodities, so is Guyana, is newfound oil. So very few countries have made the transition. Why is it? Why does that happen? You know, India will get to the upper middle income level by 2035. But I do not believe it has any real chance of getting to a high income level in 2047. Yeah? It's not about the arithmetic of compound growth rates. You know, there is a point up to which you can grow by enlarging investment as a proportion of GDP and by having low wages. But ultimately, wages will begin to rise. Yeah? When that happens, you can make that transition if and only if you actually manage to make a transition from sort of being followers in technology to not just enhancing your managerial and technological capabilities, managerial among individuals, technological among firms, but also in terms of raising, you know, technological upgradation, innovation. Now, ultimately, those things, you rightly said, depend on education. Now, I think we are wanting on both of those. Unless we act on those here and now, there is no prospect that we'll make the transition. In education, you know, you look at learning outcomes at school in India. In education, you look at universities, yeah? You know, we are not at the frontiers of research anywhere. You know, I was a member of the CSIR Review Committee in 1985-86, and we had more scientific papers in scientific journals that were peer-reviewed than China did. We are way behind. So it is not only, it's about academic freedom, it's about institutional evolution, it's about resource allocation. All of that is missing. Above all, it's about R&D. In 1990, R&D expenditure as a proportion of GDP in China was 0.6% of GDP. For us, it was 0.66% of GDP. In 2020, for China, it's 2.3% of GDP. For us, it is lower than it was, 0.6% of GDP. So, you know, unless we get our act together in the world of education and R&D, I don't see any prospect of our being able to make that transition. Surely, as you know, if a country of 1.4 billion people, and it'll grow just a little, not that much more, it'll stabilize by 2045, you get to a per capita income level. Remember, we're at 2,800. We're amongst the poorest countries in the world in terms of per capita income even now. If you get to 12,000, yeah, still upper middle income, it will improve living conditions. But I think we have to be more ambitious than that. Thank you. Let me stop.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Let me now invite my colleagues, Dr. Kishore Davla, Dr. Munir, and Dr. Anand, to felicitate our three very esteemed speakers who enlightened us this morning. Please, so let them begin the process. So please, Kishore.
Thank you, Sachin.
Thank you.
So please stay here because we are not starting a new segment. We are continuing the discussion just in another form. And while we are adjusting the setting, I was thinking, where else on a Sunday morning we would be convening in an arena like this to talk about externalities, middle income traps, the global south, and so on and so on. So the other point is about where else maybe than in Bihar we could do such a thing and also call upon interdisciplinary approaches, etc. And where else than in Nalanda we could ignite a series of ways to think about the future of the Agenda 2030, Common Development Goals, and so on, trying to make some linkages between very, very different things. And it was said this morning, societal approaches, labor markets, scientific disciplines, and so on and so on and so on. And I will just recapture the following words: desirable, what is feasible, what is possible, what is probable, what is plausible. But also, we have designed the entire 2 days of this inaugural edition of the Nalanda Development Dialogue as not a moment to pitch for answers, right, or solutions. We don't need solutions neither today nor tomorrow. What we do need from the excellent series of inputs, hopefully, that we have tried to gather is how do you frame a discussion that we can see is coming in multiple places in the world at the moment, from multiple directions, but somehow lacks a bit of strength and backbone when it comes to future development options. And we understand that there can be some usual or continuation ways to address those, but there needs to be also other ways, right, which is what we are trying to shape here. So we are a bit late on the schedule, but I would like to convene for the next steps of our discussion, and we will try to make it as lively and interactive as possible. André de Melo e Souza, the head of International Policy Center for Inclusive Development from IPEA in Brasilia, Brazil. Thank you, André. Please join me on stage. Jagjit Sareen, Area Chair, Climate and Sustainability Council for International Economic Understanding, and also a prominent person in Dalberg Advisors. Jagjit, please join me on scene. Veselin Popovsky, where I see Veselin, he must be somewhere here. The Executive Director of the Center for Study of the United Nations at Opejindal University in Sonipat. And Srinivas Yanamandra, where is Srinivas? FinTech Consultant, Associate Professor of Practice at IDBRT in Hyderabad. And Dr. Malhotra, last but not least, of course, Chairman, MP, Food Commission, Bhopal, and former Member Secretary of the Indian Council of Social Science Research. Please join me on stage. Dr. Popovsky, we are starting also with you. So you will immediately notice that also we are on the March 8th and we are celebrating women. There are some distortions, so apologies for that. And this is an indication also of possible ways to progress. And of course, I would like to mention our dear colleague, Dr. Saikat Sinha, professor and former head of the Department of Economics, Jadavpur University in Kolkata, with whom we will make a series of concluding remarks. So, estimated colleagues, gentlemen, let's be very practical, right, in that segment of our discussion. These whole sets of plenary exchanges were designed around the notion of reframing development, right, towards and beyond 2030. I think we have largely covered the questions of issues, priorities, but also we have started to address the questions of new fields of investigation and cooperation or operation. But we want to get a bit more hands-on. We want to be a bit more specific, right? With what about now and the way towards 2030, but also what about post-2030? Do we need such deadlines or do we need other objectives? And then how to proceed. But also, and as Professor Sonobe was also referring to the Resina that just took place in Delhi in the past days, we need to understand even beyond politics, in terms of making of science, in terms of interdisciplinary approaches, in terms of digging into new concepts, etc., how India, and I think the last words of Dr. Deepak Nair in that sense were extremely clear, right? How fresh and new ideas can also come in India, incubated across multiple ways, disciplines, and approaches in India, and how, if so, this can be pursued, right? And this can become one of the pillars or one foundation for collective future thinking, right? And then, of course, with all the impacts and issues for India itself, right? So this is, in essence, what we would like to try to achieve. And then after lunch, which will be a relatively concise lunch, I know how I say lunchtimes are important also for all sorts of informal interactions, but we will address the questions of foresight and pathways, insisting again on the issues of economic development, economic theory, and so on. And tomorrow, we will address two very different and important issues. First, the Northeast, what we have named Northeast India Highlight, because we are here in Bihar, just nearby the Northeast, and there is a vivid series of trends in that particular region which could inspire us here in Nalanda, but also which could serve probably as reservoir of inspirations. I remember, I don't want to be too long, but during the T20 itself, there was an excellent, for example, series of roundtables in Shillong, in Meghalaya, about some aspects of our discussion in biodiversity, in biomass, and future of economic growth, etc. And then in the afternoon, after this Northeast India highlight, we want to come out of the Nalanda Development Dialogue with a little bit more precise understanding of how this track to operation could be also fostered through continuation, as Vice Chancellor was referring to, continuation of formula of Nalanda Development Dialogue, and how this can be also part of other sets of ongoing discussions about the future of an overall development agenda, which we understand is a victim of a number of flaws and external constraints, but remains extremely important and maybe even more important than ever. So, dear friends and colleagues, this is in essence what gathers us on a Sunday and on a Monday. And now, getting back to our session of now, who would like to start by reflecting on these issues of really reframing development towards and beyond 2030? We are not just talking about the SDGs or the targets or etc. We are really trying to think about that, because it's policy making and some underlying factors of diplomacy, academic diplomacy, but also trading ideas and shaping also new ideas out of everything what we know or what we have experienced, and how such cooperation that we are trying to implement here can serve as stepping stones for future options. Dr. Veselin Popovsky, and then we'll go to Andre. Oh, please, you can use the mics which are in front of you, so we don't need very formal presentations. And if you are speaking too long, I will cut you.
Sure, I will be short. Thank you, Nicholas, for introducing the excellent team we are all together. First of all, let me say my big privilege and honor to be in Nalanda University in Bihar. I come from O.P. Jindal Global University in Haryana, and I'm very impressed by Nalanda development. Thank you, Vice Chancellor, for the honor to be here and to see that remarkable achievement. Namaskar, and happy to be with you. I think India is really a laboratory for development. What we heard this morning really is impressive. What India achieved, no other country in the world has achieved. And not only in terms of development, India is the best example of development, but also in terms of democracy. By the way, no other country in the world after colonialism had maintained democracy for 77 years. If you look at all other colonies in the world, they went through horrible totalitarian regimes, autocracies, civil wars, coup d'etat, genocides, local wars. India is a remarkable example of peace, development, respect to democracy, respect to constitutionalism, respect to rule of law. And I'm always asking why. It's really an interesting question. Why India did that no other country in Latin America, Africa, and Asia did. So it's really a question of leadership, respect for rule of law, constitutionalism, independence of judges, and remarkable Indian people. Now, we heard this morning that India is demographically challenged, but nevertheless, I hope that 1.5 billion people in India, and actually young people, if you take China, a lot of those people are elderly in China. In India, about 2/3 of the population is less than 35 years old. So we have 1 billion Indians that will shape the future of India, the future of Asia, and the future of the world. And that brings me to the next point, the education, also mentioned by Professor Deepak Nair, by Shamika Ravi this morning. The role of education, the role of gender, we're on the 8th of March today, and the role of health are very connected to the reduction of poverty, to the reduction of hunger, elimination of hunger, we heard this morning. Almost no extreme poverty left in most part of India. And you know, I teach United Nations law. I work for the United Nations for long years. And I was always challenged by my students who say, why do you teach something that is collapsing, that almost doesn't exist? And my kind of a counter argument is to go to not peace and security, where obviously United Nations have failed, but to development, to humanitarian assistance, to eradication of diseases, of vaccinations, and of all other achievements of the United Nations. However, in terms of development, it is not really the United Nations, it's not really the World Bank, it's not really the IMF, it's the national development strategies of countries like India, Indonesia, most of African countries, Latin American countries that made that remarkable achievement. Now, Nicholas invites us to talk about future. It's always a bit of a tricky to talk about what will happen in post-2030. And I think this conference already gave us the next narrative, the next language. It should be a common development goals. We had Millennium Development Goals, very much time connected to year 2000. We had Sustainable Development Goals, much connected to the importance link between environment, climate change and development. And we are coming to 2030 very shortly, in 3 years. And I think the language of this conference, Common Development Goals, is probably a good way to summarize and to formulate the future, because the goals are interconnected. We experience that over time, as I mentioned, health, gender, education, oceans, climate change, all of them help the goals to be seen as one. They are common in terms of interconnectedness, and also they are common in terms of geography. They apply to every single country in the world, but also to every single individual in the world. So I would like to see the agenda post-2030 being very much humanized, very much individualized, less mathematical, less even economic, as we heard from Thomas and others this morning. It's not only the numbers and the statistics. It's what people make out of development, how human life has changed, and what do individuals benefit from development.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
For the
I
moment,
have some more points, I will leave them for later.
No, that's perfect, and thank you very much. Common development goals, common sense, common people, etc., etc. We can probably leave here with this notion of common development goals, hopefully. Andre, so I must introduce you a bit because it's rather specific and we are very lucky to have you around, right? You are familiar with the G20, the group of think tanks in the G20. You are familiar with IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa cooperation. You are familiar with South-South cooperation. You are familiar with triangular cooperation. And you are familiar with the BRICS Academic Forum and BRICS discussions and dialogues on multilateralism. So I would say somehow you are the man of our day in that sense, because the way we also would like to hear from you is really how can we incorporate such a multiple sets of dimensions to address both the understanding of where we are, but also possibilities of ways forward regarding these questions of common or sustainable development goals. Andre.
Many thanks, Nicola. You're being too kind to me, but I appreciate it. And many thanks to Vice Chancellor Sachin and Nalanda University for the opportunity to be here in such a beautiful campus in the state of Bihar. I think it's useful in looking forward to where we're going in terms of the new development agenda to see where we're coming from. And as already was mentioned, we had at the turn of the century the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. There were 8 goals that were supposed to be fulfilled by 2015, and they had merit. They resulted in significant progress in reducing extreme poverty, in improving education, and in combating diseases. And actually, when it comes to poverty reduction, the target to have the proportion of the population living on less than $2 a day was achieved ahead of schedule, and largely because of the performance of China and India. If we exclude these 2 countries, then the results point largely to stability. In terms of education, we had primarily enrollment rates in the developing regions reaching 91% by 2015, up from 83% in 2000. And when it comes to health, we had global under 5 mortality dropping by more than half, and new HIV infections falling by approximately 40%. Gender parity in primary school enrollment was also achieved in many regions, even though disparities remained in higher education and in employment as well. And when it comes to environmental sustainability, while 2.6 billion people gained access to improved drinking water, there were still over 800 million people living in extreme poverty, and environmental degradation was still ongoing. There were challenges and problems as well with the MDGs, much of them having to do with regional and social disparities. Sub-Saharan Africa faced the slowest progress, particularly in reducing maternal mortality and improving sanitation. Weak institutional capacity in conflict-affected regions also severely hindered progress, and economic crisis in 2008-2009 increased vulnerable employment, particularly for women. Now, the MDGs were criticized for not fully addressing the root causes of poverty. They were also the target of criticism for being designed in a top-bottom approach, meaning there was lack of participation from developing countries, effective participation at least, as well as from non-state actors or civil society groups. And we also see that there were 7 MDGs that presented highly specific operational targets and deadlines for reaching them. And then we had MDG 8, which was vague and non-precise, if you will. Now, mind you, these 7 MDGs focused primarily on obligations of developing countries, which were the ones that still had to reach the set targets in all of these areas of social development and the like. Whereas MDG 8, which focused primarily on development flows or development cooperation, if you like, it referred primarily to the responsibilities of the high-income countries, and it was not precisely designed, as I just mentioned. And although developed countries aid for achieving the MDGs, they rose during the challenge period. More than half of this aid went for debt relief, and much of the remainder went towards natural disaster relief and military aid, rather than development itself or the focus of the MDG agenda. And finally, there was also perceived failure to address gender issues in the MDGs. And then we come to the SDGs, which succeeded the MDGs. We're supposed to take over from 2015 all the way to 2030, as you know, and they sought to remedy many of these perceived shortcomings in the MDGs. They resulted in 17 goals, 169 targets, and expanded range of development issues. Now, the SDGs themselves are a target of criticism for being non-binding, for being underfunded, and oftentimes contradictory. As of now, only about 12% of targets are on track, based on the data we have. And key criticisms say that the model focused too much on growth over environmental preservation, and that there might be a trade-off or a conflict there, that it lacks enforcement mechanisms, and that it's too broad to be effective. On the issue of non-binding and non-enforceability, clearly the goals are too many. They they include everything under the sun, if you will. And this means that countries can cherry pick what they will try to achieve and disregard the rest. And this also means that countries can continue to follow whichever policies they would favor in the absence of the SDG agenda and still comply with this agenda. There also are trade-offs and issues of policy coherence, right? If you want to achieve SDG 8, which refers to sustainable economic growth, most likely you will not fulfill the SDG 13, which has to do with the environment preservation, as current resource-intensive growth models are economically unsustainable. The goals are also seen as too broad and too vague. There are, as I mentioned, 169 targets. The agenda is too sprawling, and it doesn't have a hierarchy or set priorities, right? And just to give you one example, one of the goals is end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Again, it's suggesting it's broad and vague. If I had to pick 3 priorities in the SDG agenda, I would suggest 3, which has to do with health, 10, that has to do with inequality within and between countries, and 13, which has to do with the environment and climate change. I think if we could focus on these 3 priorities, which also, by the way, tend to focus on global public goods, we would achieve a lot. But if we try to achieve everything at the same time, we will most likely fail. And then there's the issue of data, and I'm wrapping up, Nicola. There's a plethora of what was so-called tier 3 indicators that lack data, they lack methodology, and they're still non-operational. The targets lack specifically defined thresholds. I coordinate SDG 17 in Brazil, which means I helped to draft the chapter on SDG 17 for the report on Brazil. And what we see in SDG 17 is targets that use terms such as mobilize resources, invest, improve, assist, promote, help. And these are very vague. There's no well-defined threshold, and it's very difficult to objectively determine when a country has fulfilled the SDG, or better said, its targets, its component targets, or it has failed to do so. And finally, we have a chronic problem of underfunding, too, and which suggests that the SDG agenda is, by and large, unrealistic. We would need a massive multi-trillion-dollar fund to fulfill the funding gap, and this was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which also hindered implementation tremendously. And I'll stop here. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. So I hope you have noted the right numbers, right, for the grand prize, the number 3, the number 10, the number 13, right? But otherwise, thank you for reminding us of MDG 8, which somehow could be echoed by the SDG 17, right? They are all the sectoral SDGs, and there is something, right? There is an umbrella, and we don't know exactly what it is about, but it's regularly being referred to as very important. I would like to insist on 2 elements here. One, we are talking about Africa, and then India, then China, then etc. But here in Nalanda, there is another direction, which is the one between South Asia and Southeast Asia, right? And I think for the future discussions, this panel and the others, how much the complementarity between South Asia, India, Southeast Asia, I'm thinking about Indonesia, could also serve as a way to steer new directions for thinking. So not the usual big blocs versus middle powers, not just the usual north-south or south-south, but also what can be learned from such directions when you look back at history, trade, intellectual movements, religions, and so on and so on. These are forgotten roots, which have not been forgotten in Nalanda, which are part of the foundation of it, but which could also serve as a good source of inspiration. And then, regarding the future of the SDGs, while we are talking here, and we have other friends, we have many friends at IPEA. I'm thinking about Fabio, for example, who is an author in the Future Global Sustainable Development Report, which will exactly be about also future of the SDGs. So again, they are not just one place where these discussions are taking place. What you are to do is how much this development format of dialogue in Nalanda can be relevant. So for that, Jagjit, you are part and you are circulating among also different sets of discussions arenas. You were in Harvard not long ago, right, at the Kennedy School of Government, giving lectures, etc. What would be your view about this discussion, role of India, possible whereabouts, and reservoirs of innovation?
Thank you, Nikolai. First of all, thank you very much to Vice Chancellor Sachinji for inviting me to this very, very important discussion. One of the reasons, in addition to the intellectual stimulation I'm getting from this discussion, was to just be at this place. You know, growing up in our history books, we have learned about Nalanda, and just to be here, it's an honor and a privilege. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. One more thing, you know, when I was looking at this wonderful bag given to us, is this booklet. As they say, you know, charity and sustainability begins at home. And looking at this, the green ventures you are leading at Nalanda are very, very commendable. I wish and hope that all our universities in India and in Global South and globally lead with this example. You know, zero excess energy, zero waste, zero water. And if we can't do it at home, preaching to the world is, in a sense, waste of time. So kudos again to your leadership. I hear all the cars are going electric and solar everywhere. So for me, this is, yes, cycle. And I hear you've been cycling, so it's a great inspiration. And I encourage you all to follow this lifestyle. Having been polite in my introduction, let me now be a bit provocative. And wake you up a bit at the end, you know, with this good AC and good breakfast. Some of you might be falling asleep. I think I would challenge all the three words in the title, common, development, and goals. Who defines the commonality, common for whom in this world? You know, common is the first thing everybody is challenging. They're going with me first. So common goes out of the window when your first articulation of national interest is very raw and first, me first, America first, make me first in it. Second bit is development. You know, again, having worked in the UN, World Bank and all that, developmental articulation was essentially for developing countries and their interests, their developmental challenges, problems, and we kind of narrated a long list since morning. But think of the global north. They're going through their own developmental challenges now. Reindustrialization, migration, health issues, aging population, you know, even rights are being challenged, social discord, harmony. Yesterday somebody was talking, you know, it's not far-fetched to think of, and don't quote me on this, a coup in the United States. Given the way things are going. You know, people are thinking of those wild scenarios, given the kind of tensions you see, the divide, the discord. So essentially what somebody could argue that global north, in a sense, is, you know, mirroring some of the developmental challenges of global south. So in that kind of a world, fast forward 10, 15 years from now, I think the definition of developmental challenges would be very, very different than the typical definition of, okay, education, water, health, and all that. So we have to kind of think about that very, very differently. And the institution, the resources, and who defines the developmental agenda. The other bit is, I think we haven't discussed much about, is the technological advancements. You know, the AI world we are living in. If you hear Bay Area leaders, they're talking about singularity in 5 years. Machines having consciousness. And while we haven't figured out the old ways of thinking about collective consciousness, now machines are going to drive the consciousness agenda. Just think of that and the impact it's going to have across, it's already having. Think of the trillionaires it's producing in the world and the power concentration among few individuals who are driving. Look at NVIDIA's capitalization, it's 4 trillion, more than what India aspires to be in in many years. And the force it's bringing in any discourse in terms of the digitalization agenda. So I think when we think of a future, I think we have to underpin digitalization in every field of life, every developmental aspiration, but also the downside digitalization is going to bring across in terms of the resource intensity, in terms of breaking down further the social contracts. You know, country after country are now introducing this ban on use of social media under 16 because of the tensions it's bringing in the social harmony at that level. So I think we need to start thinking about technology as an escalant across, but also the tension it's bringing north, south, everywhere. The other bit which we are talking, I think, and recognizing, it is the green agenda. And think of it, the energy transition, but also think of the impacts climate change is going to bring. So if you ask me the two trends we should think more carefully as we think forward is the digitalization of the world and the green transition of the world. And every other aspect of developmental aspiration would have these two trends weaving through it. And if we don't manage the interplay between the digital and the green carefully, I think the Mother Earth is toast in more ways than one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So a little bit of household rules. In principle, we have 8 minutes left according to our program, but that's a little bit cruel, I think, right? What I would like to suggest, if that's agreeable from everyone, is that we keep on rolling till quarter before 1 p.m., right? Then we can adjust the lunch, we can adjust the next session and the visit, Jagjit, I know you came from that, for that, to the old Nalanda site, right? But let's make sure that we keep to our program, but if everybody agrees, let's do that, right? So that we have a bit of time to continue our exchange. At this moment, my dear colleague Saika, do you have any remarks since you will help us wrap up the session? Do you have any remark at this moment?
No, not that. I'm just listening to it.
You are listening to everybody and you're downloading, so that's very nice. I would like now to turn to Dr. Malhotra and to Dr. Yanamandra. Dr. Malhotra, you've got a wealth of experience, right? Internationally, nationally, interacting also with many different bodies, scientific bodies, and so on. Out of that, and knowing your trajectory, and how do you view a discussion like this? How can we carry it forward? What would be the triggers so that we leave Nalanda after tomorrow with force or with ideas? What should be the main directions? Or maybe also what should be avoided?
Thank you, Nicholas. And thanks to Nalanda also for taking this initiative. I'm very, very sure that this kind of a development dialogue would definitely go several miles and set the tone for many things to unfold in future, in fact. It's a very timely kind of a thing that we are discussing. I intend to focus on few areas, as very well suggested by Nicholas, in fact, that what may have happened. We have discussed several things, in fact. There are 2-3 things which I would very candidly like to share with all of you. One is that we perhaps somewhere believe that the kind of model that we offer from the top has to be accepted by all, in fact. Then, I mean, within the SDG framework, goals and targets, and universalization of those goals and targets, did not ever think in terms of that it did need some localization also. That's one thing. Secondly, when we talk of these goals and targets, we have to very categorically look at the situation that what are the core goals and targets which have to be essentially accepted by one and all. Then there is a scope for optional goals and targets, which could be accepted by some, may not be accepted for regions that they can put their details on, and then localization of those targets. Specifically, Nicholas, the question that you have tried to raise, I was looking in terms of researchers, in fact, what kind of questions researchers in the world must ask. So one, and I would definitely, my context would be interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and at places transdisciplinary also. When I look at Earth system governance and planetary boundaries, you look at the aspirations of the different countries. You club those aspirations together and then ask yourself this question: can our planet afford all those aspirations? We need ample amount of research between the trade-off, on trade-off between the aspirations of the different nations and the planetary boundaries. That's one thing. And I think nothing much has happened perhaps in that context. The speaker before me has already raised a question related to AI, and that's very, very relevant. AI will definitely, in days to come, would guide us, drive us in many ways also. There are opinions coming from none other than the technologists themselves that there is a hype about it also.
That there is?
A hype about it. Too much of investments may not be definitely going towards the productive channels. There is an opinion on that, and it's a well-researched opinion. We must start this discussion that where should AI in days to come, maybe over next 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years time frame, it should be taking the world impact. So that discussion has to be initiated under our common objectives or common goals if we are discussing the foundations of those common goals. If we think in terms of mere extension beyond 2030, we have to decide in terms of these options. Whether we are going to simply extend it, we are going to have a patchwork around it, we are going to reform and modify it as well as it could be possible for us, and we are going to start, whether we are going to start altogether a different dialogue. So these could be our options. Another question, which has come in the inaugural session itself, and we heard from none other than Thomas. We definitely must think that combining psychology, economics, and sociology together, again in an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary frame, inclusive wealth index, happiness, human flourishing, how this all could be made possible. So merely achieving a growth, certain development targets is not going to make the world happier, because our priorities are, I do not know in which order do we put it: peace, prosperity, and progress. So we have to decide in terms of that order also in which these priorities have to be. In fact, the way world has progressed, if we look at it, we needed a development cooperation, we needed innovation cooperation, we needed cooperation in the area of technology, but where do we stand today? So sovereignty, as far as AI is concerned, would be a crucial question, not only of discussion, but also of researchers in days to come. I'm raising an important question here. When we have been saying for several years that we are scientifically sound, but why then our policies are failing, despite us being scientifically so sound? And researchers of the world definitely must address these questions. I have a number of things to talk about, but because of paucity of time, I'll stop here. So thank you very much.
But please, everyone, write down these questions that you are raising, because we need to be very conscious that while we are talking and agreeing upon a number of factors linked with those aspects of sustainable development and the likes, etc., in the broader context, there are real risks that this development agenda is being sidelined by other considerations. Thomas Pogge was talking about subsidies. Subsidies for military equipment at this moment is also becoming very prevalent. And there are also money transfers from ODA to other aspects. And the development arena is not a standalone one, right, in the world, whereas a transactional, power politics, etc. So how can, and the race for time also is something very true. And in the next 15 minutes, we might want to circulate among those questions. But last but not least, Dr. Srinivas from the IDBRT, Hyderabad. What is IDBRT? But also maybe, oh, you can please sit, stay. I give you permission. Okay, you are taking the permission, I give you permission. But let's hear from you about your view, maybe introducing like financial parameters or macroeconomic parameters into our discussion, banking issues. Please, the floor is yours. But I will cut you too. Huh?
Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas, for this opportunity. And I thank Professor Sachin sir for having me here. It is always a pleasure to return to the campus of Nalanda University. Thanks to Kishore and the Center for the Studies in the Development and Sustainability. This is Srinivas here, and I work for Institute for Development and Research in Banking Technology. It is an institute set up by the Reserve Bank of India. I am an associate professor visiting, and I am an independent fintech consultant. And my encounter with respect to development banking comes from two major career stints, actually. One with the BRICS New Development Bank as the chief of compliance between 2017 till about 2022, working in Shanghai. And also after that stint, coming back to India and seeing the development banking not just at a policy level, but also at a grassroots level, working for a fintech entity called Paytm, the largest payment company in the country, which does a lot of developmental related lending, for example, the digital lending support through technology. So between these two, starting from the policy level experience and then seeing the grassroots level technological impact and development, I would like to make few remarks in terms of the topic that is given, like what exactly is the development agenda beyond 2030. I'm glad that the speakers before me have touched upon what exactly is this transition means beyond 2030. I think if I were to put it in one sentence, the transition, the development till now has been institution-led, but the development beyond the 2030 is going to be technology-led. I think that makes it an important case for the kind of focus that we need to have on technology. And what does exactly this technology-led development entail? Normally, when we talk about development finance, we have three important constituents of the development finance. Basically, it is infrastructure-led, so the massive investments in the infrastructure leading to the development. And the second one is in terms of the safeguards that we need to put in the development finance, environmental, social, governance-related safeguards. And the third one is the way in which we try to create frameworks which are multilateral. I think these are the three key underpinnings in terms of the institution-led development. But when we talk about the technology-led development, I think the trajectory completely changes to new dimensions and new questions that we need to answer for ourselves in this juncture. Now, when we talk about first the infrastructure, the debate of the infrastructure will move from what is a physical infrastructure to what is a digital infrastructure. When we talk about digital infrastructure, the digital public infrastructure, what exactly is the compute we need to put in, algorithms that we need to put in, the data that we need to put in, what we call as generally the digital public infrastructure. The second question we need to focus is whose duty it is to set up the digital public infrastructure. Should we leave it to completely to the government to set up the digital public infrastructure, as the case in India it is happening? Or do we expect the private players, like the way it is happening in the United States, also to take the lead in terms of setting up the digital infrastructure in AI, blockchain, the payments interfaces, for instance? And the third one is, once we set up the infrastructure, how are we going to democratize that infrastructure for the benefit of the larger society? And when we are democratizing the access, what is the price that we need to charge the society? For example, the payments is a good case in terms of India's democratizing the DPI with respect to the payments. UPI is coming out as a free. but what exactly is the cost and the sustainability in terms of making this kind of an access free by the government. So we need to also think through in terms of the pricing of this infrastructure development is an important thing. And when we move to the safeguards, we only know the safeguards in terms of environment, social, and also the governance-related safeguards. But we also need to add one more dimension here, that is the human dimension, actually. So while we talk about ESG in the context of institution, we also talk about ESGH, the H being the human-related factors in the technology-led dimension. When we talk about the human, like the data, for example, what kind of a data protection mechanisms that we need to keep in, because we are now talking about digital data protection for the last few years, but as we move forward, when we get into digital health, mental data, for example, or the neural data, or the genetic data, for example, also becomes an important dimension that we need to start protecting ourselves. And then we have the cyber-related matters, the cyber crime-related matters, how we are going to tackle, and also the AI, the way the AI is going to displace the jobs. If you are seeing the news, we are seeing these days the renthuman.ai, where AI is recruiting the human agents actually for the purpose of delivering some of the tasks. So how do we need to factor in the job related to AI displacement is something. And lastly, if we talk about the multilateralism, I think we are all used to what is called as Washington consensus, but I think the world is slowly shifting to what I generally call as BRICS-style coexistence. It is not Washington consensus, but it is BRICS-style coexistence. You have to respect the pluralism of all the countries, which means how do we have to have common standards in such kind of a coexistence? So who defines the common standards, for example, in the area of AI? Like we are now seeing a kind of a huge disparity in terms of the standards on AI. Same way, the kind of the cooperation that we need to have in terms of the cross-border data flows. So how do we tax them? How do we share them? How do we localize them, for example? And lastly, how do we make sure that some of these multilateral frameworks also get enforced? Like the recent United Nations Convention on Cybercrime, for example, is not at all fully signed by all nations. So if such kind of a disparity exists between nations in terms of tackling an important aspect like cybercrime, how are we going to ensure that there is a kind of a cooperation to make enforcement is also an important thought that we need to do. So to conclude, we are now moving from institution-led to technology-led development, and that is going to impact in the way we conceive the infrastructure. We ensure that there is an ESG is enhanced by the human factor, and also the multilateralism moving from Washington consensus to BRICS-style coexistence. I think these are the kind of questions that we need to focus on if your agenda is to go beyond 2030. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then one remark and one very quick question. The remark is we are surrounded by conflicts, wars, and so on. And you're completely right to add the questions of organized crime, which is not a small pattern in the world economy at the moment with multifold impacts. And clearly, if we look ahead about this kind of conversation, common development goals, etc., our community is not very well equipped, right, to address those questions. Other specialists and questions and arenas are. And maybe one question is, how do we kind of install a dialogue or cooperation among such different spheres, right? Or we decide to ignore them and to push the development agenda whatsoever. That's more of an open question. And the question to you, Dr. Srinivas, you mentioned New Development Bank and so on. And throughout the morning, constantly we have been referring to, oh, we need more people-centered or people-oriented or human indicators. Sometimes we're talking about human flourishing indicators and so on and so on. Do you think that the new framework of New Development Bank, other multilateral development banks being very much kind of supportive of a so-called Global South agenda, I'm very careful with the word and maybe oversimplifying, could be a source of supporting new kind of socioeconomic indicators or new ways to address the long-known limitations of existing frameworks such as GDP?
I think yeah, I think the New Development Bank as an agenda is basically a work in progress. It has just been set up in 2015. So the first 5 years has been spent in terms of laying down the institutional foundation and to get the initial set of the loans that get rolling. But the next 5 years is basically in terms of the expansion of the membership. So there is not much in terms of the agenda setting as such, which is expected at the NDB to start with. But definitely in terms of the aspiration, the kind of frameworks that it started building up, like completely different from what the way the world has practiced the development banking so far from World Bank and IMF, for example. So that is a kind of a different approach that NDB has taken. One important thing is basically the way in which the country systems come into foreplay. Like it is not completely dependent upon the World Bank set standards on which the financing happens, but it is the country systems that that take priority. And also the way in which the financing has to happen, not a dollar-centric world, but in terms of a local currency-centric financing that the bank has to do. So these are the two major initiatives that has happened in the BRICS Development Bank at this stage. But as you rightly said, I think there is a work that needs to be done ahead in terms of moving from the financial aspect to the human-centric aspect. That is still a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I suppose these would be also questions that should be developed under the chair of Andre and together with Professor Sonobe and Dr. Kastrop in the next session, right, about these questions of macroeconomics of growth issues. As for now, I would like just to know if there is any remark, maybe Vice Chancellor or anyone from the floor, and then we will try to wrap it up nicely and give the floor to our distinguished concluding thoughts person, Saikat. So we'll take a few remarks. The mic is coming right to you.
Thank you very much. I'm from Indonesia, and it's a privilege to be here. I had two key remarks, which I don't think we have really discussed so far. The one is the underlying changes in the structure of decision-making that we are going through in the world right now, where countries may become far less relevant than we think of them today. For example, if you look at large corporations that we've heard a little bit earlier, and assume that they were countries, of course you'll find that NVIDIA will be richer than India, and Apple will be richer than Germany, and so on and so on. But they're also now directly intervening in international decisions and technological locations, and so on and so on. The second layer is not just doesn't end there. The second layer are mega cities. You know, you do the same exercise. You know, if New York was a country, etc., etc. And these cities are dealing directly with each other. They have, you know, a very close relationship among themselves, and so on and so on. So, in this layer of interactions, and on top of that, we have all the technological uncertainty and the issues about wars and conflict, etc. How do we deal with this future of uncertainty, as it were? You know, and we haven't really discussed that. The second very fundamental issue is that I think we are at a moment of, you know, very existential questions about what is the meaning of a common humanity. A lot of the work on environment always keeps saying we are a common humanity, and therefore we must face common dangers, etc., etc. So much of the medical research, as well as all the advances in AI, are actually showing that within the next 10 to 20 years, we could be on the verge of creating a totally new kind of human being. And suppose we had a new kind of human being, and David Sinclair in Harvard and lots of people working on this, which are now saying that we are capable of creating human beings who could live for 300 years and have IQs of 300 or 400 years. And this is not a dream, it's actually happening. In the same way we didn't believe in AI and so on, we're getting this. Just one last one, just want to close this. In that world, what happens to the common development goals? Who makes the decisions? How do we think about it? And these are issues that we should also be thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, very nice and important remark. This is also why we thought, let's think about foresight, because we need such ways to, I say, look at future options completely separated from the ongoing spheres of policy making in the different arenas of the economy, banking, etc. But then how to rebuild pathways out of that, right? And I don't think at this moment we have a clue, honestly. But let's raise those questions in a nice way here. So, are there at this stage any other notes or remarks? I see plenty of students which are really at the back of the room. So let's take one more and then wrap up. And be concise, right? Because you have plenty of time to interact during lunch and coffee and so on.
I'm Professor N. Surjit Kumar from Indira Gandhi Tribal University. Basically, I'm from Manipur. We have been talking about the Global South cooperation, and we have been talking about IPSA, BRICS, and all. And Sir Srinivas has mentioned about BRICS coexistence and all. So when we talk about international relations, we remember only two things. One is cooperation, and at the same time, conflict. So when we talk about this BRICS, like there is one term that is rivalry within unity. So we have also the conflict between India and China. So how we will go at the same time, like since we have India and China conflict, I mean, in terms of border. So when we talk about BRICS, so how we will go with this conflict at the same time cooperation in the coming days? Thank you.
Thank you. I suggest that this question can be also part of the discussions of the next two plenaries, including tomorrow, while we will be thinking about the way forward. So now I suggest let's wrap up our discussion like this. I would ask any of our distinguished panelists, including Thomas, to say a few words about let's not forget that, or let's insist on that factor. And then I will give the floor to Dr. Salkat. Please, who would like to start? Dr. Popovsky?
I want to address the question by my dear friend from Indonesia. And I find decision-making crucial, mostly because, as we all agree, the challenges are global, but decision-making remains very much national. And not only it remains national, but most of the governments think short-term rather than long-term. Obviously, why? They want to be re-elected. And re-election is something that happens 2 or 4 years. Whereas if we want the long-term vision, how to solve the development and the climate problem, we need the lifetime, as you mentioned, much, much longer than just the time to the re-election. So 2 big problems, and I don't really know the answer. How to connect the national decision-making to the common globals, to the global issues and challenges, and that is not an easy one. But also how to make governments and corporations investing in long-term solutions, because they need to report to electorates or to shareholders in terms of corporation very much short-term. So that's my problem. Long-term decision-making is missing because of the short-term interest of governments and corporations to be re-elected.
Thank you. Jagjit?
Yeah, I'll just add. I think in these discourse, what is hugely important that we engage the so-called Gen Z, because they are the AI generation and they can tell us more than what we think ourselves. The second is private sector. I think most of the solutions will come from there, but most, having been part of the UN, they're mostly out when these goals and everything is being agreed, negotiated. So I think we shouldn't repeat those 2 mistakes. Thanks.
So I think the students' community would not disagree with you, right? Dr. Poge?
Yeah, so I'm a bit of a SDG or development goals skeptic, I have to say. I remember vividly that the development goals language replaced the human rights language at a crucial moment at the end of the 1990s. And the human rights language, thinking of poverty, thinking of hunger as human rights issues, of course, gives them an urgency and a priority that is now gone. The Millennium Development Goals, the basic idea was we set some goal and we hope that economic growth will simply achieve these goals. There's nothing we have to do about it. We simply say, let hunger be halved in 15 years or 20 years, and economic growth will take care of it on its own. Now, that didn't actually happen, and what we find the world today is we have an average income of about $75 per person per day, and we have somewhere around 2.5 to 3 billion people living below $5 international dollars per day. And those people are the people who still cannot afford a healthy diet. They are living in indignity. They're living hand to mouth in food insecurity. And it is a shame. You know, even though it's better, the situation is better than it was 30 years ago, it is still a situation that relative to what today would be possible given today's economic, technological, and administrative capacities, it is absolutely shameful that we are not getting people at least to that $5 level that is 1/15 of the global average.
Thank you very much. Dr. Malhotra, Andre?
On that question again, in fact, those of us who have followed the Dario Amodei's statement or discussion with the Department of War, I mean, they can appreciate the kind of complexities that this world is involving at different stages, in fact. So private sector is a major player, and at places, especially in the age of technology, is determining the fate of so many things. So they also need to be brought to the table, in fact.
Thank you so much. Andre?
Thanks. Very briefly, I think we've clearly come a long way. The SDG agenda has managed to introduce gender issues, for instance. It was a process that was a lot more bottom-up than the previous one, but it resulted, again, in a plethora of targets and objectives which are unrealistic. And evidence of this is that when you look at the urgency of financing for climate, that agenda of climate financing has been proceeding completely outside the SDG framework on its own, if you will, right? So we need, and in the context of what Professor Nayar set up for us this morning, we need to be very pragmatic, I think, in going forward. Development is not high on the international political agenda by any means. The priority of countries are elsewhere. When you have armed conflict, that tends to trump everything else and subsume everything else. We know that. And so, again, just focus on few key issues, I think. Move forward within sectors or within like-minded countries as you may, and try to proceed on that basis, because I think that's all we can do. And it is indeed, just one final mention inspired by what Professor Pogge just said, I think it's also regrettable that the left movements, the leftist movements in the world, by and large, have abandoned the rights-based discourse in favor of more identity ones, which are exclusionary, as opposed to, if you frame your issues in terms of human rights, they're all inclusive, and that does give more force and urgency to what you're claiming. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I hope our dear next generations from Gen Z have taken tons of notes, because I suppose this could nurture presentations, dissertations, and future debates. Vice Chancellor, a word?
Thank you. Thanks, Nicola. Good that you refer to Gen Z. Nalanda, they are a bit stressed because tomorrow, a day after, they begin their midterm exam. So they all are preparing for their midterm exam that would be beginning. It had to begin, I think, one day earlier. We have postponed it because of the Nalanda Development Dialogue, and they would be taking it forward. I just wanted, but I wanted them to hear this conversation and hear both Professor Deepak Nair and Professor Thomas Pogge, both. So good that they are here with us. One point that I want to raise, and I think what came out today morning in
keynote address by Thomas in terms of multidimensional thinking of new development paradigm. And I think the distinction that we see between Millennium Development Goal and Sustainable Development Goal is on 3 counts. First and foremost, MDG tried to quantify. So how much poverty, how much health services, how many blackboards in school, etc. All that quantification. SDG made a departure to quality. So not food security, but nutritional security. Not clean water, but quality of water, quality of air. So this distinction between quantitative to qualitative, the idea of integrating development. So Andre, the goal 3 is what health should be, but it is linked with goal 6, which is clean water. It is linked with goal 2, which is about nutrition. So nutrition, health, and clean water are intertwined. And this intertwining of objectives is something which has given us an integrated framework. So instead of sector-specific things, SDG made a departure from MDG in terms of internalizing an integrated approach. That's the second part of it. Third and last, which I think is extremely important, that's the challenge before us, is lack of resources, the goal 17, where the money would come from. And this is where I think much of the thinking has to go. How we bring in this integrated approach to what Das Gupta committee and what Professor Deepak Nair emphasized, the donut that Thomas showed us today morning, I think gives us the resource mobilization, which we would be covering in the next session. The point, Nicola, that I want to mention, which is also very important for us, is to see this new development paradigm that Jagjeet mentioned in terms of energy. So how you bring in that energy transition, how you bring in resources that are needed for this transition, and associated with that is this huge challenge that we are facing is in terms of measurement. How do you bring in appropriate measurement? So challenges at this stage for development paradigm are at these multiple levels. And that's where the integration issue comes in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, an easy challenge for you, Dr. Saikat. Fortunately, we don't have to summarize the solutions, but the key issues that arise from the discussion this morning. Please. Yeah, please. And then I will pass it on to my colleagues for the household rules and the thanks for the felicitations for the session. Please.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Nalanda for bringing me here, giving me this opportunity, but it's a mammoth task in front of me. The 6 speakers or 8 speakers or more have spoken on many issues. I will not talk about individually each of them. I'll try to summarize what are the challenges and the way going forward. I take the cue from Professor Nair and Professor Poge. From the morning, they said that how development thinking has moved over time, and then the quest for multidimensionality, which Professor Poge, the metric used to be used for development in future, that's what they started with. And while doing so, different layers of those new paradigm that is emerging, the new ways of measuring it that's emerging, that's what this session discussed all about. Now, there are many uncertainties that has come about and many solutions. The first was whether MDGs were all right. The questions were raised. When we moved to SDGs, whether they were all right. And I think very succinctly, Professor Chaturvedi has said that it was integration when we moved from the quantification that was done in MDGs to qualitative information that was in SDGs, more in SDGs. We were trying to integrate the two in the development paradigm. That was one. Now, when we move towards a common development goal beyond 2030, what are the challenges that we are facing? Now, the first challenge that we have is the kind of uncertainty that we are in. The kind of uncertainty, whether it's geopolitical uncertainty to start with, or many other economic uncertainties, technology-led uncertainty that we are in. And the question that needs to be addressed in the context of uncertainty is whether development is going to give us the kind of resilience that we require to tackle with this uncertainties. The resilience has become the key catchword these days to go forward. So we need to address those issues relating to resilience. The other kind of uncertainty is one that is, apart from the geopolitical uncertainty, is the climate risk. We haven't adequately addressed those climate risk, not here, but otherwise. We are doing research, issues are coming up, the IPCC is there, but issues are not being, new challenges are coming up. It's like a shifting goalpost that comes up every day. Now, that needs to be addressed, how we go about doing that. And then the technology-led uncertainty that is there, with the advent of the coming up of digitalization and AI, what kind of uncertainty or uncertain world we are into, how humankind is going to be adversely affected, how they need to be integrated in when we are having, and when we talk about human beings, it's not only one homogeneous human being, it's men versus women. So gender, how we need to address in the context of this technology-led uncertainty. The other thing that we need to look at is actually the rural-urban divide across space. What uncertainty would lead it, whether it would lead to more inequitous society that we already have. The third thing is about crime and corruption. That also needs, that's an issue that development paradigm needs to look into. And now we have issues relating to megacities. We have, but above all, the global economy, the developing economies are undergoing through a process of structural transformation. Whether the process of long-term structural transformation that we are in, whether that would lead you to new kind of uncertainties that are there. Now, we have to think of whether a new development bank with new technology in the fintech and all that, whether that can address the issues relating to mitigate these uncertainties. That one thing that I would say at the end is with regard to resources that we require, the Agenda 17 of the SDG. And with respect to climate change, or address climate change, resource is a major issue. Where do we get resources? A recent research which I did on climate finance, it has come out in the journal called Ecological Economics. Can foreign aid address this issue of this climate risk variability on agriculture across nations, 150 nations, and we found that foreign aid in terms of research aid, which can develop capacity for these countries, can actually lead to mitigate agricultural variability that is arising out of such uncertainty with nature that's the climate answer. Thank you very much.
And with a lot of uncertainties, that concludes this opening plenary and opening segment of the Nalanda Development Dialogue. You have all found those programs, right, in your wallets, etc. I must thank very much the students who have been working overnight, really to make sure that all the material could be prepared adequately. Thank you very much. And now I will pass it on to Dr. Kishore for all the logistics of the end, the formal end of our discussion. We will restart our discussions otherwise at 2 p.m. in another location. So please, Kishore.
Thank you, sir. So we, because of the time, so we have a lunch, the same place where we had the breakfast at 1 to 3, and then given the logistic issues, so we will have the next session at the round table, which is next the building. Our students at the campus and will guide you, and then we will also have so it is a the ancient site, heritage site, which will close by 5 o'clock. So we want to quickly finish our next plenary session. From it is a 2 to 3:30. So 3:30 will wind up, and then 3:30 the buses will take you to the ancient site. And then we will return back by 5:30 to back to the campus. And then we will have a campus tour. And then we will have the fireside chat at Honorable Vice Chancellor is hosting the dinner at his Vice Chancellor's residence. So we will have the debate, Nalanda style debate, and also we will have the dinner at VC's residence. So we will guide, our students are here, so and then all the support, logistic support with you. And then we will, so this is now we'll go for a felicitation function. So I request our chair to felicitate our panel speakers. Professor Thomas, can you felicitate the Professor Malhotra? We have like a felicitation. Felicitation. So we just like to put the words and then do that. Professor Malhotra. Professor Popovsky. Dr. Andre. Dr. Andre. Professor, I thought he has come. Professor Popovsky. Jagdish Saringji. Dr. Srinivas. Professor Saikat Haroy. Yes, sir. Yeah, Jaggeet. Jaggeet. Dr. Srinivas. Professor Roy. You do with that. Yeah. Professor Roy. You first you go. Yeah. Thomas will give it to you. And Dr. Nicholas. Dr. Dr. Nicholas. Yeah, please. Sure, sir. I'll need to check that. I request Dr. Nicholas to felicitate our chair.
Because in the future, people will be commenting on what happened in Nalanda as part of the right to recognize the So thank you very much also. Thank you very much. Apart from the formal part, this is also very friendly spirit part. Apologies for the little bit of time mismatch, but we'll try to get hands-on the content in the afternoon, but also not to miss you, Nalanda. Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Everyone, let's have lunch together, and let's recap the at
2 sharp here, please. 2 sharp, so that we can make it a heritage site visit also.
Good, thank you. By the way, we need at least 2 hours for the audience, but if we start at 1 hour and 30 minutes, it's really short. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much.
Give me, and then I'll give it to my team. Anyways, there, Agam, so he will be there. Agam will be in the round table.